The storm climbed out of the western sea, as if the ocean itself were rearing up on its haunches, slate and iron and green, a moving wall threaded with veins of pale lightning. Theon's cloak whipped and snapped, salted spray sewing itself into the weave until the cloth hung heavy as a sodden sail. The bridges of pike yawned beneath him, rope and plank flexing under each barefoot step. Below, the surf crushed itself into the black teeth of the rocks, and the rocks ground it to foam, and the foam fled thin and white into the dark. The wind brought fish gut and tar from the quays, cold iron from the smithies, wet kelp and old salt from everything else. It brought the voices of the islanders too, blunt and unadorned. Theon had learned those voices first as a child. Later he had learned the softer, broader sounds of the Greenlands and worn them like a borrowed cloak. He thought of that now and imagined taking it off, folding it and laying it on a bed that did not belong to him anymore. "Still up here, puppet?" Asha's voice, effortless as if she spoke at a hearth rather than atop a swaying span in a blowing gale. She came out of the spray with the wind in her hair and a grin tucked into the corner of her mouth. She had salt on her eyelashes. Her boots were dark with water to the ankle. "You always did like a high place, if only so there'd be farther to fall." Theon smiled because he had learned to, because smiles could be armor where mail could not. "I thought to watch the storm," he said. "I'd forgotten how the god shows himself on these shores." She snorted and leaned on the rope. "He shows himself in dead men and drowned nets, little brother." Her eyes flicked to the line of the horizon, where the storm's black ramparts were smearing into the lighter gray of the afternoon. "Father will want you. He sent me to fetch you like a fisherwoman sent to drag a stubborn eel from a pot." "Mensao." He glanced toward the Elder Keep, its windows narrow and black, the tower rising out of the rocks as if thrust there by some quarrelsome god in a former age. Balon Greyjoy had ever been part of the landscape here, as permanent as those towers, as hard and as cold. Theon nodded and followed Asha down, hands on the wet ropes, feet finding their knowledge again after too many years on carved stairways. They crossed through the inner ward with gulls flinging their thin cries and men bent over broken anchors. The doors to Balon's chamber were open, and within, the light ran over maps and salt-stained flags hung from pegs. Bones of old fish, a whale's jaw turned into a bracket for a lamp. The iron crown lay on the table like a rusted trap sprung in the dark. Balon stood behind it, his hands spread on the map, fingers yellowed with age and tobacco, joints knuckled as if someone had hammered nails through them and not quite pulled them out. Aeron Danfair stood near the hearth, water clinging to his long hair so that it glistened like eel skin. He smelled of rain and a strange sweetness that Theon remembered only as something from childhood. Seaweed burned in a clay bowl, or crushed bladderwrack, or the marshy, storm-washed scent of the gods. Victarion was not present. The air was quieter for it, free of the weight of his gaze. Theon went to a knee because he knew the ritual as a man knows the steps on a dangerous stair. He bowed his head because almost no part of him wanted to. Balon looked at him as if he were a gull that had flown in with the weather. "You've forgotten to wear the sea, boy," Balon said, voice creaking as if from a chest that had been waterlogged and dried again too many times. "You smell of the Greenlands, of dogs and flowers." Theon kept his face smooth. "I bring you my oath and a peace," he said, "from the king in the north, who was my brother in all but blood." Aaron's mouth twitched in something like a smile, though on his face even a smile looked like a wound closing. "Your brother in blood is the sea," he murmured. "The Greenlands borrowed you. The sea reclaims what is its." "Then?" Asha stepped around Theon and sank into a chair like a cat making itself comfortable in a place where someone had just told it not to sit. "He brings an offer," she said, spinning a dagger on its point in the wood and letting it topple. "The wolf pup wishes to clasp hands with our father and sail together against the hungry lion. So I hear it through mists and storm. Is that much true, Theon?" "Danda." "It is," Theon said. He had practiced the words on an empty deck, under calmer skies. They felt thinner here. Robb Stark offers ships and honors when the lions are beaten. The North and the Isles as friends. He would have you as Lord of the Iron Islands with all your old rights and not a finger raised against you. He asks you to keep your strength at sea, to close the western coast to Lannister relief. Damn. Balon's knuckles went whiter on the edge of the map. He lifted his eyes, and Theon felt what a netted fish might feel when the fisherman's hook came near. All my old rights, Balon said softly. The rights I took once with blood and iron and fire. The rights the usurper took back with smashed ships and my sons cut down or taken away. Then I wonder. Aeron lifted a damp hand. What is dead may never die, he intoned. Other hand making the sign like a wave, but rises again. Harder and stronger. The Greenland King offers what? Bread? Fruit? A soft bed and a tame dog to lie upon it. That is not our way. It is not, Balon said. He straightened and reached for the iron crown, and it seemed to Theon that when he lifted it, there was a sound like a hinge grinding somewhere in the stone. The boy king plays at Wolf, the stag at Riverrun, the lion at King's Landing, the old stags in their towers, children and bones and memories. The sea still moves, the tide still takes, the tide still gives. Did he think to bid us hold the shore for him, as if we were some fisherfolk paid in copper? Then, he expects you to be a king, Theon said. Low. And to act like one rather than a reaver, father. There's honor in joining. Asha's laugh shaved the air thin. Honor? Hear that, uncle. The wolf pup taught our little brother a green word to carry home. He sets it on the table like a delicate shell, and asks us all to marvel at its color. And now, Aaron's eyes hooded. There is a word, but it is not the one he brought. The word is obedience, to the sea only, to the way that was and will be. Balon slid the iron crown onto his grizzled hair. His eyes were pale and flat as tidal pools under a low sky. Your news comes late, Theon, he said, and his mouth thinned so that the edges of his lips cut into the chill of his face. We are already a king and already decided. The south burns itself and the river lords drown one another. We do not fish, we take. He hit the table with 2 fingers where the map showed the long green shape of the north, slim as a spear shaft. Here. We take here. The wolf runs too far south and leaves his den unguarded. We run a spear through the neck of his home and pull. The riches of the Greenlands pour out into the sea. We take the stony shore, the rills, the fingers of his coast. We take Moat Cailin and close his road. We squeeze until his eyes pop. Then sense. Theon felt his breath stop, then start again like a man who had stumbled into cold water. Winterfell has no stones that swim, Balon said. How do wolves defend their den from a tide? They cannot. The shoremen of the north build nets, but we are knives. You will captain one of my ships, boy. The sea bitch. I will give you seasoned men. You will prove your salt. Girl, you ride for Deepwood Mott. Victarion holds the straits. I lead the taking of Moat Cailin. And so. Theon found his hands had curled on themselves. They hurt. He had not noticed how tightly he had made the fists. No, he said. The word left his mouth and tasted of iron. No, father. It is. He swallowed. He could see Robb's face in dim firelight. Not a boy's and not yet a man's. Jaw darkened by the first stubborn stubble. Hair that had begun to fall as a king's hair might and not as a child's. Robb had clasped Theon's forearm before sending him. Only you can do this, he had said, and his fingers had been warm through leather. Theon had laughed then, and clapped him on the back, and said that Idrik the whale would carry him like a lord. He had not thought the sea with its long memory would remember him different. It is folly, Theon said, and tasted his own fear. He lifted his chin. If you strike the north, the wolves will turn, and the river lords. Again, Asha's laugh. Softer now. The Greenlands have made you soft, Theon. You fear too many shadows. Our father has counted the river lords. He can count to 2 even in a storm. They are pride, and they are land. They do not float. It is not fear to see a thing as it is, Theon shot back. I have sailed coasts the length of the world, and moored in harbors under rocks, and in reed-choked rivers where the mud tried to take your legs if you stood still. I know the sea, sister, and I know the north. I slept beneath those trees. I hunted in that snow. The men you speak of will not break like reeds at a shoreline. They will come at you in the dark and cut your feet with ice and eat your campfires. They will burn the nets on your drying racks, and they will string your men up by their heels in the pines as a warning to the gulls. Aaron's face rucked in offense, but Balin only watched. Theon had the sense he was watching not a sun but a weather vane. The wind had shifted. He was seeing if the iron could rot. You were taken by them, Balin said. A hostage lord, a game to dress in green and gold, and pretend at lordship. You wear their tongue like a whore wears a borrowed necklace. And now you come to me and beg me to be less than I am. Theon's skin crawled, and his heart ran like a boy down a grass hill. He found Asha's eyes, and saw there a narrow, keen curiosity, as if she had brought a rare shell to her ear to hear the sound of some distant storm. He lowered his gaze. You will do as you will, he said, and he could hear the smallness in his voice and hated it. You always have. Good, Balin said, and his teeth showed a little. I am glad we are agreed. Go to Harlaw with Dagmar and take the sea bitch. Put your wolf's tooth where it will do me some good. Then, Theon bowed. He did not let his eyes meet Aaron's or Asha's again. The ropes on the bridge skinned his palms as he crossed, and the wind licked at the roots of his hair. The sea blew spume into his face like handfuls of broken glass and tears he had no mind to shed. He found his chamber and shut the door on the cold iron of the keep. He stood a long time. He watched the water run down the window glass until he could not tell where the rain ended and the sea began. He poured wine into a cup and did not drink it. He thought of gray stone halls with warm rushes, of Bran's careful voice sounding out a lesson with a finger on a line of letters, of Robb's laughter when a dog nosed his hand under a table, and the plate slid. He thought of the heart tree in Winterfell's godswood, red leaves and white bark, and of the thing in the wood that could not be weighed in any scale of iron and salt. He took up a scrap of parchment and a bit of sharpened charcoal, and he wrote as quickly as he could before his resolve lost its breath. Father means to strike the north by sea. He will take the moat if he may, and shut the causeway. He has given me a ship, and means me to be part of this. I think him mad, and yet he's my father. Stop him if you can. Stop me if you must. He stared at the words. They were not what he had planned to write when he'd left the Greenlands. They were not the words of a messenger. They were a confession threaded with cowardice and honor in equal measure, and he could not cut the two apart cleanly. He folded the parchment, sealed it with the wax of a candle stub, and pressed the signet he still wore, the one that had not left his hand even on shipboard. A deer wolf's head sank into soft red. He called for Wex by habit. The mute boy came as silent as a cutlass drawn in dark. His eyes had the watchful brightness of a gull that has learned the pattern of a fisherman's net. Theon held out the letter. Wex's head cocked. Ravenry. Theon said. He pressed the boy's shoulder hard enough that Wex's face tightened. Tonight. Not by the day. Wex nodded once, and was gone into gorge and wind. Night came down quickly under that storm, a bruised lid lowering. Theon slipped out with only a blade at his hip and a coil of rope. Dagmar Cleftjaw's men drank in a circle around a low fire by the lower quay, their voices thick with a song that had no words, only a chant that moved in the back of the throat like surf. Theon kept near the fish sheds and smelled old salt in the timbers. He had known every knot and nail of this place once. He let that knowledge have him again, and felt the weight of it as if it were a net he could wear like a shawl. At the far end of the quay, the Miraham still rode, a Taroshi trader with painted eyes on her bow. Theon knew the captain a little. He had played dice there earlier with Asha to test her teasing. The man had loud rings and a heavy purse. He'd keep a sleeping crew in a storm like this. The wind made men think of home and ale. Theon kept his shoulders loose and his steps light until the shadow of the ship took him. He crouched by a coil of wet line and listened until he could hear his own breath steadying. Another sound among the sounds. A figure loomed, hunched against the rain. Theon slid the knife's point under the man's chin before the man's eyes had finished their widening. "Soft," Theon said. "Soft, friend. You never saw me. You're going to let your ship drift a little tonight, and you're going to take on a passenger who pays." "Bah." The man had the right instincts. He froze, made his breathing small. He smelled of tallow and fish. "They'll gut me," he whispered. Theon moved the knife just a hair. "Not if you don't have a name," he said. "And not if you never saw his face." They moved like seal and rock. The ladder swung and hit the hull with a dull thwack. The deck was slick, the sails reefed. The crew pretended not to see an extra shadow slip down to the hold. Theon found the dark between rolls of woven mats and slept with the weight and grind of the sea all around him. The smell of jute and arrears of apples and wet rope, and a rat that enjoyed the old skin of an orange in the corner somewhere. He woke once to voices, Tiroshi sibilants and the cracked iron of an islander arguing in whispers with the captain over a fee. He woke again to thunder. At last he woke to a different movement in the air, less brine, more river. When he climbed to the deck, the wind still cut, but it smelled of wet grass and mud under stones. The mouth of the white knife opened ahead, brown and green under a long low sky. Behind them, the storm had torn itself into ragged banners straggling across the west. Manderley's harbor took the Miraham into its wide mouth. The sea gate loomed, carved with mermen whose eyes were set with old pearls. Theon drew his cloak close and showed his signet to a guardsman in white and blue. The man's eyes flicked and then flicked again when he saw the gray wolf, his mouth thinning as if careful not to say anything that would taste like trouble. They sent for a steward, and the steward for a captain of household, and the captain for Lord Wyman himself. The merman's court was damp in a civilized way, like a cellar where good wine sleeps. Lamps turned in their iron cages. The sea was made a friend in mosaics here, tastefully bridled and set to pull a chariot where a fat king sat with his legs arranged just so, trident like a scepter. Lord Wyman's bulk made the throne look modest. It creaked gorgeously as he shifted. He wore rings worth ships, and his eyes had very little fat upon them. "Theon Greyjoy," he said, and the name rolled out of him like a barrel down a slope. Too much momentum, no alarm. Of Pike, of Winterfell, of whatever room he is in when he says his prayers. "What brings you to my hall in this fine weather?" "Duty," Theon said. He stood without fidgeting. He had been raised to do that in another hall, and in front of a different weary king. "Lord, I come from Pike with news of an intended treachery against the north. Balon Greyjoy means to strike while the wolves are south, to take your coasts, to take the moat, to choke your roads." Wyman's face did not move much. Only his eyes altered. "Treachery," he said, as if he were testing how the words sat upon his tongue. "From the Iron Islands. We shall need a bench upon which to faint. Rise well," he added, and one of his captains made a sound suspiciously like a swallowed laugh. "You bring this to me first." "I bring it where I can trust men to act," Theon said, and the speed with which the words came surprised him. "Ravens fly slow in storms and slow in fear. The sea runs quicker. You have ships and men, and a virtue that sells dear in this part of the world. Order." He glanced toward a painted map where the coast of the White Knife's Bay was carved with tiny fish and smaller boats. He pointed. "Here, here, and here. Coves where raiders can land unseen, where they've landed before. If you set watches at these points and a chain of beacons up the river, you can sting any ship that tries to slip its way to the little harbors. And you can move men upriver more swiftly than by road." And shh. One of Wyman's captains, a lean saltbeard with hands like driftwood knots, snorted. "And you know this how, Greyjoy? You're not known to have spent your youth patrolling for raiders." "Benandi. Ezo. I hunted gulls and dogs when I was small," Theon said. "Later, I hunted with wolves. Later still, I hunted the winds between Bravos and Mire. I've seen men land where no coast has the right to allow it. I know what the sea will do for a man who asks rudely. If you don't wish to hear my counsel, throw me back in. The tide will judge me faster than you." "Menderau." Wyman watched him for a long beat. Then the corners of his mouth pulled back a finger's width, and he sighed like a bellows set gently to rest. "We do not throw men in the sea in White Harbor," he said. "That is an island habit, and they may keep it. We sink them properly with stones when they have it coming. But you do not have it coming. Yet. We will set watches. Reswell. Send men to the Wolf's Den with orders for the harbor chain. Have them test it twice every tide. Dispatch ravens, north and west. I will write to my sons." He looked back to Theon. "And you say this plan comes from the Lord Reaper himself?" "It does," Theon said. He kept his hands open. Show fighters' hands with no dagger in them. "Lord, I mean to go on to Robb Stark and tell him what I've told you, and more. But I need boats to take men to the coves and a small, fast ship to carry me up the river and away again with the tide." Wyman raised 2 fingers. "You speak quickly," he said. "It is a habit of men who know they are chased." "Who chases you, Lord Theon? Your father? Your sister? Your old ghosts?" "None," Theon said. And it was not quite a lie, and the awareness that it was not quite a lie made his voice flatter. "Only time, and time is not a man you can run from by changing roads." "Ah," Wyman said softly. He leaned back and took his own measure of time, belly rising and falling as if sea-cradled. "You may have my boats. You will take Reswell's son with you up the river. He has a quick hand with a tiller and a quicker one with his knife. You will leave me 2 men who have seen the places you speak of, to talk my men into making the same shapes with their eyes as your men do. And then to look farther. If you mean us well, leave something of yourself here that you'd hate to lose. That is how I know a man is not just passing through my hall with a mouthful of birds." Theon lifted his hand, slid the direwolf ring from his finger. He did not look at it as the gold left his skin. The flesh there was pale and indented. He held the ring up, and all at once it seemed to weigh more than it ever had, as if the spirit of the thing inside it had decided to remember what it was for. Wyman reached, and the ring looked very small in his wide palm. "Keep it safe," Theon said. "I'll come for it." "I think you will try," Wyman said. "And that is another kind of promise." The river ran like rope pulled through hands raw from hauling, and it smoked in the cold mornings. Rushes rattled, and the banks were full of the small deliberate businesses of men who lived not quite at sea and not quite on land. They looked at Theon with a glancing wariness that was the same in any port anywhere. The man on the dark prow might be savior or storm. In the night, fires pricked in a chain Theon had asked for. Men took pride quickly. He saw that and used it, praising a beacon until men upriver wanted their own to burn brighter and sooner. Reswell's son was a spare man with a scar that began in the hollow of his throat and ran down into his shirt. His name was Cregan. He did not smile easily but did not waste words, and when he spoke, his words were bent to work like nails or knives. He asked where Theon had learned to taste the wind, and Theon said, "On a deck," and Cregan said, "We're the same kind then. You learned with sails, and I learned with canvas on a wagon, but either way we had our ears open." At the Wolf's Den, the great chain that barred the harbor mouth rattled up from its bed, where barnacles had taken it for years. Men swore and wrestled it, and a boy lost a finger and did not stop working until someone noticed he had only 4. Theon stood and watched, and did not interfere, because men worked better when only the tide judged them. Reswell's son came and stood shoulder to shoulder with him and said, "You carry the wolf on your hand under your glove." And Theon said, "Not now." By the 2nd day, the ravens had gone up, and by the 3rd day, the ship Wyman promised was ready and riding the current like a fish that wanted to jump a waterfall. Theon took a small chest of coin and a jar of pitch and a coil of line and 2 men from White Harbor, along with Wex, whom he had found on the dock in the dark, with his eyes on the sea as usual. The boy's gaze was a line drawn out to the horizon and tied to something there. Theon wondered at what it was. He did not ask. Some lines broke if you plucked them to hear the note. The upper reaches of the white knife narrowed, and the cold under the trees increased. Mist clung to the water under dawns that came like a hand uncovering a dish. Sedge made whisper sounds. Geese lifted like thrown stones when the ship's nose peeled along a bend too close to their chosen water. Theon slept under a rough sail and woke every hour with the heat of guilt under his skin. In his dreams he saw Winterfell's gray walls and the heart tree beyond, and his feet would not carry him, frozen as if someone had poured the bitter river into his bones. The river-run camp was mud, and tents and moments of steel flashing out of the daylight like fishbacks in a narrow stream. Standards raveled in the rain and unwound again when the sun came and the wind with it. Robb's banner was there, a wolf's head snapping, gray on white under the king and the North Seal. Theon found himself slowed by the nearness of it. When he went to the tent, he meant men stood aside because they remembered his face, or else because they remembered that he had belonged somewhere once, and that mattered to them more than time and circumstance. Inside, the air was meat and wax and wet dog. Catelyn Stark stood near the table, one hand on the back of a chair. She had iron-born eyes in that moment, cold and measuring. It startled Theon, though he knew she had been a Riverlord's daughter long before she had been Lady of Winter anything. Robb stood with his hands on the map, as Balon had stood earlier, and the similarity made Theon's stomach turn over once as if the deck had shifted without warning. Around the table were Bolton with his pale assessing eyes, the Greyjoy grinning with the hunger of men made for war, Brynden Tully like a carved piece of river rock that had learned to move. Theon went to a knee again. The dirt in this tent smelled different than the dirt at Pike, and made the gesture easier. "Robb," he said, and then caught himself. "Your Grace." Robb's breath came in like a boy's and went out like a man's. "Theon," he said. He stepped around the table and pulled Theon up by his arm as if the two of them were alone, as if all men around them had suddenly become trees. Theon felt the strength in his grip, and something else he did not want to name. "Up." Robb stepped back and looked at him with a frankness that made Theon want to look at the floor. "You have the sea on you. And worry. Bad news." "Yes," Theon said. He did not soften it. Catelyn's face did not change at all. She read what he said as if he had written it on a page. "Balon means to strike the north. He will move on Moat Cailin and close the neck. He will take your coasts with reavers in the night. He has given me a ship and a command." "Has he?" Catelyn said softly. "And what did you do with it, Theon Greyjoy?" "I gave it back to him," Theon said, and some of the pressure in his chest left him with the saying, "I would have thrown it in the harbor if it had been mine to throw. He offered me salt plunder of my home, and I told him to take his salt to the storms." The Greyjoy made a sound like a bark. "Huh," he said. "The wolf found a pup that'll bite something besides his own tail." Bolton's eyes did not blink. "We should consider the possibility that this is a lure," he said in a voice smooth as the inside of a shell. "You should always consider that," Theon said. "It would be a lure if I were cleverer than I am. But it isn't." He struck on his own account and for his own pride. He will bleed men into the pines and the sea, and not count the cost until the storms have eaten their fill. "Then?" Robb's gaze went to the map. His fingers ran along the neck of land that fell into the riverlands like a bottleneck. "If he takes the moat," he said, speaking partly to himself, and partly to the notion that a man thinking aloud consulted a god whether he meant to or not, "he bars our way home. But he needs ships and numbers to take it, and men to hold it in marsh and fever. He's never held it, but then we have not tried to take it from raiders before." "Nemsor." Brynden Tully leaned in and placed a finger where the swamp symbols gathered into a dark tangle. "You do not take the moat by banners and orders," he said. "You take it by finding where the stone remembers it was raised and how, and then you pry each memory free with sweat and knives. They cannot come at it with trebuchet, but they can poison it with their blood and leave sickness for you." "Da." Catelyn's knuckles had turned white where they touched the chair. She loosened them consciously. "Sir Roderick will be at Winterfell," she said. "He will have warning. My boy." She stopped herself, and in the space after, the only sound was the tense cloth flapping, muttering to itself with the wind. "Bran will have men. If a reaver sets foot in the Godswood, he will lose it." Robb looked at Theon again, and the second time was different from the first. "You came to me," he said. He did not couch it as commendation or question. He named it as you might name the weather. "I did," Theon said. He saw again Balin's thin mouth and Asha's bright eyes, the crown lifted in hands that had long since forgotten how to tremble. "I do not want you to bleed because my father is proud." "You are not your father," Robb said. He said it as if the words made something true that was already mostly the case. "No," Bolton murmured. "What men are is the trouble. What they are not matters little, until the knife and the moment come." "We guard the coast," Robb said, standing straight as if he had drawn a sword inside his own skin. "We send riders to every lord with land along the shore. We send men to the neck whom the marsh will not eat. We send to White Harbor for protections at sea, and we send to Sir Helman Tallheart to stiffen the stony shore. We do not break our plans against the Lannisters for a raid behind us, but we do not let our tail be bitten to bone." He looked at Theon again. "You know those coasts." "I do," Theon said. "In ways the Ironborn will hate." "Good," Robb said. "You will go to White Harbor again and then along the shore as my man, to set the watch, to set the nets, to pull the posts from the beaches and make the land unfriendly. Take men from Manderley, who can ride boats, and men from Tallheart, who can ride ponies and make them friends. Make them speak one another's words." He turned to Catelyn. "Mother, I would have a letter to Sir Roderick that opens every door in the north for Theon. I would have letters to Lord Wyman and Lord Hornwood, and to the Mormont women on their island." "The Mormonts do not need my letter to spit an Iron Man," Catelyn said, "but they will take pleasure in reading it." She inclined her head to Theon. Her hair shone like river water. "Make yourself useful, Theon Greyjoy, and you will be forgiven much." Theon nodded, and did not say what rose in him. Forgiveness was a sort of coin, and he had brought none with him, but he could learn to take it for pay if it were offered. He left the tent in a falling rain that washed the camp smells, and made everything smell of pennies and wet wool. Grey Wind sat outside with his jaws open, breath steaming. He watched Theon go with a wolf's lack of curiosity, which was somehow worse than a man's scorn. Theon lifted a hand foolishly, and then let it fall. His journey back downriver felt like a punishment that had been turned into an errand. At White Harbor, the chain rose and fell with the tide, because he told it to, and not because it chose to. Armsmen wore clean tabards and drank measured cups because he ordered them to measure. He took 4 boats and sent them to drift at anchor in hidden skidways, with people in them who knew the difference between patience and idleness. He took wagons laden with smooth river stones to certain headlands, and had the stones piled in neat stacks whose meaning would not be apparent to a man coming in from the sea. He taught men to throw those stones in patterns on signal to make water break oddly where a longship needed smoothness. And he did not tell them that he had learned the trick from a Wreathport smuggler who had once let Theon win too much at dice. He went north and found Deepwood Mott suspicious, the forest thick and wet, and unwilling to move or show help. Asha had already pried at the edges. The people here had the long-faced watchfulness of those who expected guests only in the kind of numbers that could not be fed. Lady Glover greeted him in a steel shirt, and listened to him like the raw end of a blade listens to a whetstone. She sent her men to the woods with axes and spades, and put a watch of girls with good bows up on the palisade. They spoke in 2s and 3s around the fire with the rain behaving like a 5th person. Theon heard in their words not fear, but an unwillingness to waste breath. They had no time for men who came from the sea with excuses. On the stony shore, he rode with men who loved ponies more than anyone could love a house or a tower. They moved in and out of the forests on paths that did not exist until a man had ridden them 3 times. He learned how the tides here pulled differently, running the length of the shore like a dog that had found a different kind of prey. He made a friend of a woman with a scar like a stringer line across her mouth. She had a voice like rasped rope. She walked out to a headland and showed him with a hand how the breakers ran in sets of 6. How on the 7th a narrow passage smoothed just enough for a longship to slip its teeth in, and how on every 3rd set the 7th failed. 7. She could count the ocean as if she wore it under her skin. When the Ironborn finally came, because even a plan may come to fruition if it is lesser than the tides. It was in fog that behaved like a thing alive. Theon saw the shapes of the ships as negative space, hollows in the mist. He smiled without humor, because he had known men who believed that if you did not see land, it could not see you. The tide was half up, and the stones his men had stacked on the headlands were already piled in boats. He sent signals with a horn, and with a blanket on a pole, and with the silence of his own body, which was the kind of signal that moved men better than any other. The first longship ran slight and sure into a bay that held it as long as was necessary for the fog to alter its mind. On Theon's sign, men on the cliffs loosed stones, not at the ship, but into the water where the swell would take the splash and turn it into trouble. The next wave broke after the fashion of a dog asked to heel and heel now. It spun the longship's nose and took just enough speed from her to make her oars useless. She kissed the reef with a wooden tooth. The second ship, Overager, came in hot and glanced off the first. Theon, on the cliff, felt the shudder in the way a man feels a blow land on a friend. He raised his hand and dropped it, and the pitchpots fell with their own dark prayer of fire. Men screamed, and men did not. Some jumped into the sea and found it did not love them. Some clung to wood, which loved them no more than the sea did, but at least did not kill them as quickly. Theon watched and counted, and made himself not think about how a boy he had known on Harlaw used to giggle when he found crabs under a rock. He did not think about Asha's mouth. He did not think about Balin's eyes. He thought about the shape of the coast, and how his men would need to move their line now to catch the third ship before it learned from the first two. He sent the signal. The fog hid his shame. They took 11 prisoners once the fog lifted sufficiently to make mercy seem like something that did not defy the gods. The surviving longship limped out beyond the stones and hovered as if waiting for a command it did not want to obey. Theon went down to the narrow beach, with wet stones trying to roll him, and the smell of char and cut rope and men in his nostrils. One prisoner was a boy with hair, the color of old straw jaggi. He refused to look at Theon. He gazed at the sea like a thing that had trusted and been betrayed. "Where do you hail from?" Theon asked. His voice was even. He had learned that from men who had learned it from other men. The boy spat, and Theon stepped aside and let the spit wash back onto the boy's cheek with the tide. "Harlaw," the boy said finally, resentful of the part of himself that allowed information to be taken. "Captain's name is Hargren. He will cut your belly and feed you to the crabs and marry your sister, if you have one." "She'd not take him," Theon said. "Her taste is better." He crouched and held the boy's gaze until the boy could not help but see him. He watched the flicker of recognition. The traitor's son, the wolf's dog. He let it burn and die. "Who leads?" he asked. "At Deepwood." The boy's mouth tightened, but Theon had also learned what to say to make mouths open. "She bears an axe with a crow-carved haft," Theon said softly. "She drinks beer instead of water when she rides because she mistrusts what comes through thin soil and too many roots. She finds men who will follow her without asking if they meant to." "What is her name?" The boy's lip curled. "Asha. Herself." "Good," Theon said. He stood. The fog thinned like an old shirt worn to threads. The surviving longship turned and made for the long curve of the horizon. It looked insulted. Theon brushed water from his hands. "Send a raven," he said to Cregan Risewell, who had appeared beside him like a boulder grown a man's shape. "To Deepwood Mott and to Winterfell. Tell them Asha's banners hover. Tell them not to open doors for friendly voices." "Men see." Cregan nodded and lifted his hand in a gesture that had comforted more ponies than men. He used it on the men now. They moved with the inexorable grace of people who had been given something to do that was bigger than their fear. That night, Theon did not sleep. He walked the ridge above the headland and listened to the sea's conversations like an eavesdropper at a lordling's door. He tried a prayer to the drowned god, but it sounded like a shout in an empty hall. He tried another to the heart tree at Winterfell, and that one made his teeth ache rather than his heart. He settled finally on speaking to neither and to both, and to Robb Stark too, because his voice knew that voices shape. "I am doing as you ask. I am doing as I was never asked and should have done. I am with your men who are not my men, and are somehow still so. I will keep your coast." He imagined Robb taking these words from the air like a boy picking thrown apples, and smiled to remember an afternoon when none of them had had scars. A gull screamed, and the sound went into the night where it could be made into anything anyone wanted to hear. At dawn, Frost pulled the grass flat and made every step a small crunch. A tin of porridge steamed over a mean little fire. Men ate in silence and woke themselves with salt and a single swallow of beer. Theon looked north and saw how the line of the shore dwindled into myth. Bear Island was that way. The women there did not write letters in soft hands. He would need to send someone bold and careful to warn them. Someone who would survive the crossing and the welcome. He turned and found the woman with the stringer-lined scar across her mouth, and he said, "Will you go?" And she said, "Of course," and he felt something in the cold day lift in him unaccountably. They put her in a boat, with 2 boys she slapped when they grinned too big. They set them off into a morning that had been made white by breath. They watched until the line of the boat drew down into the chop and disappeared. Around them, the shore moved with a quiet that belonged to woods that had learned men and did not care for them. In that quiet, Theon took a small knife and cut his hair shorter and closer to his skull, until the wind found less in it to toy with. He left the hair on a rock and watched birds peck at it. It made him laugh until he felt strange, and then it made him stop laughing because he felt stranger still. By noon, a rider came out of the inland woods with a white rag high on a stick. And Theon's men did not shoot him only because Theon had drilled them in the pleasure of waiting. The rider slid from his shaggy pony and bowed and said, "From Winterfell," and held out a packet of letters like a man offering loaves. The seal showed a wolf bitten through by rough handling. Theon broke the first with his thumb and saw Sir Roderick's hand, careful, tilting rightward, a slope like a neat hillside. He read of musters and of warnings, of peasant boys brought in from the hay to stand with spears that were more hope than tool. He read of Bran in the Solar putting his small hand on maps and asking always sensible questions about the number of men and whether they had shoes. He read that ravens from Bear Island had come with short messages written with blunt pencils. "We see them. We are not worried. Send us news, not comforts." He smiled at that, and the smile frightened him with how much warmth it held. The second letter was from Wyman Manderley, who wrote with a hand like a shipbuilder's, thick and swooping, and signed his name with a flourish that might have been a wave. He told Theon that he had Theon's ring and intended to keep it not over long, and that he had men on the river whose oars made less splash than a fish, and who now knew how to throw stones with science. He told Theon in a sentence that he could not prove but suspected a ship of the Greyjoys had sized up the harbor chain and decided to go fishing elsewhere. "It is an odd pleasure to disappoint pirates," he wrote, "for they are so seldom given honest work." Theon turned that line over and over until it became something else, a thought about his father, and himself, and the ways men named the work they had to do. The last was from Robb. Theon took it up as if touching a knife that might be friend or enemy depending on where it had slept the night before. The hand here was still boyish, letters too eager, pressing and slanting, but the words were a man's careful ones. He wrote that Edmure had duties to his own land and held the fords, that Tywin had moved with a fox patience, that the phrase barked and bowed in alternate breath. He wrote that he was glad Theon had come back, and that he meant to make use of him until his bones were worn smooth. "Do not die," he added late and small in the margin, as if he were adding an ordinary reminder to bring a cloak. "Mother says you will do something foolish or something brave or both. If you must choose, choose the one that leaves you alive." Theon folded the letter and put it against his heart long enough for the skin there to itch from the rough of the paper. Then he tucked it into the small safe place he kept in his doublet and turned to Cregan. "We take men north," he said. "If Asha means to probe Deepwood, we put her to blood before she reaches the gate. We are not the kind of men who wait inside fences even when they have good fences." Cregan nodded. The glint in his eye was faint because his eyes were not made for glints. "Good," he said. "It is a sin to waste a day when the weather gives you one." They moved in a line that bent itself to the land's lines. The sea at their left hand kept up a commentary of its own, and the wind agreed, and then disagreed, and then agreed again. Theon found that he had adopted unconsciously the stride of the stony shoremen, long and low, easy on the knees, the better for walking over rocks, there for the purpose of breaking men before they ever saw a blade. He noticed these small things about himself, and filed them away, as if taking inventory of a store he might have to sell another day. At dusk, they reached a bald point where the trees had retreated from the wind, and the ground was a spread of heather and grass, raw-edged by frost. The sea below muttered. Lights showed to the north, far and wavering, torches moving like a thought that did not know what shape to take. Theon lifted a hand, and his men slowed and stilled, and became rock and shadow. He put his knee in the cold dirt, and let its damp climb into his bones. "Scouts," Cragen breathed. "Not ours," Theon said. The wind brought the faintest suggestion of pitch on skin, of tar rubbed into leather that had known little else. There was a way Ironborn moved on a shore that did not belong to them, too certain, too careless, as if the sea gave them a title that the land had never agreed to. He could feel it. The torches made the night sullen rather than dark. His hands remembered a vow, and he made himself keep them still. "We do not fight them here," he whispered. "We let them follow their own bright sticks into a place where the ground narrows and the wind cannot choose its direction. Then we blow." He touched the small brass mouthpiece at his breast. 2 notes, and the ridge to their right would become dangerous. 3, and it would become a noise. Men who had not been taught would think the sound was the trees. They had taught it to the trees during days, while the fog hung and made its own camp. The scouts moved on, and Theon's men with them, behind them, above them. The land led the Ironborn where Theon had asked it to lead them. Up close, he could see their faces, and they looked like men made of the same mixture of shame and pride as himself. He focused on boots and rock and wind instead. He could count their number with the part of his mind that counted cards. When the path narrowed and the brush pulled tight, Theon raised the horn and breathed 2 notes into it, low and mean. The sound went under the men's feet and into the ground, and it came back as if the dirt itself had a voice. The ridge spat a shower of stones, small enough to bruise and large enough to break ankles. A woman screamed, and a man swore by a god Theon did not acknowledge out loud. Theon put the horn to his mouth again and blew 3 notes this time, and men rose among the trees where they had been lying with moss on their backs. What followed was not battle in the way lords like to describe to their sons, with clear lines and horse banners and the clean lift and fall of sun on steel. It was more like 6 men trying to take a fish off a hook while the boat rolled and the wind laughed. Theon moved, and the knife in his hand acted the way a knife acts when a man holds it who has been told by the sea itself how to kill. He did not enjoy it. He did not look away. He counted. He heard Asha's name called once, a shouted warning or a prayer or a curse. He could not tell which, and it made a cold line down his spine. In the end, the scouts left 3 bodies on the ground and took one of Theon's men whom Theon had liked because he had small children and hands that soothed ponies. He pressed the wound and said things he had heard Maester Luwin say in a different world, and the man's breath went away by degrees. Theon closed his eyes. The habit had been beaten into him kindly, which was the only way to beat a habit into a boy. He looked north again and saw no torches now, which meant nothing. The fog might be keeping them, or the Ironborn might be moving without them, or they might be gone. The sea moved and did not say. Theon felt tired and clean and dirty and proud and ashamed, all at once. Home and not home, which were the same thing in the dark, when a man had done the thing he had to do. In the morning, frost lay heavy, and the men's breath drew connecting lines between one mouth and another when they spoke as if the air wanted to know each word twice. They burned the bodies on pyres made of scrub and wet sticks that smoked more than burned. The Ironborn bodies they gave to the sea in the old fashion, because Theon did not choose for the gods. He watched them slide, weighted with stones, into the water. He said the old words under his breath, and when he had finished he felt neither better nor worse. He felt only the wind in his hair and the weight of a ring-shaped ghost on his finger, where a ring once sat. He sent 2 men back south to White Harbor with news. He sent one east to the Rills and one west toward Bear Island on a track, A seal might take if a seal could walk. He kept moving north with the rest. The line of men that was now a part of the north itself, as if a hill had grown legs and walked to a place from which it could better observe its neighbors. By noon they saw smoke that was not their own, rising thin and quick from just beyond another shoulder of land. Cragen lifted a hand, and their line crouched. Theon's heart thudded once hard, and then he breathed it down. He looked at his men's faces, set, waiting, and felt a brief wild affection for them, because they were precise instruments that had learned their song quickly, and because they trusted him as much as men, which is to say not very, but more than a little. They came upon a cove that the sea had tried to steal, and had not managed to finish stealing. A longship nosed the shore, men splashing in water to their thighs, their boots dark and heavy with it. Asha stood in the bow with her hair like wet night, an axe in her hand, looking inland as if she could see through the low black pines to the heart of the land itself. She looked beautiful and terrible, because she looked like herself. Theon felt his mouth dry with something that was not fear, and was not desire, and was not hate, and was not love, and was all of those, and one more thing besides. He set his teeth and rolled his shoulders back. Not yet, he told his men quietly. We break them on land, not at the edge where they love the water. They let the Ironborn come off the ship, and into the narrow defile where the peat rose and the water ran under the moss in secret channels that cut a man's feet without warning. Theon moved along his own line, putting a hand here on a shoulder, there on a wrist. He spoke to them by not speaking. He felt the wind's mind change, shift, settle. He felt the sea behind him breathing. He could almost imagine the heart tree at Winterfell turning its leaves to listen, though the distance was a thing no sound could cross. At his signal, the world upended. The ground sprang the traps that had been laid like a net of ideas instead of rope. Men went to their knees into holes disguised with woven grass. Others tangled in lines, stretched between stumps. Stones came from the sides, this time larger ones, carefully selected to break bones. Theon moved toward Asha because he could not do anything else. She saw him when he was close enough to know what her eyes held, and her mouth crooked into a grin that was a knife's own curve. "You make cleverness smell like peat," she called. "Come and test your axe in it, little brother." He could have answered a dozen ways, and each would have been a performance for the men behind him. He found himself shaking his head, and the move was small enough that only she saw it. Her grin tightened into something like pain. Then there was no more room for words at all. There was only iron to meet and wood to crack, and the give of flesh around hard things. They did not win nor lose, not that day. They blooded one another. Asha pulled her men back in good order when the ground decided it disliked them. Theon did not pursue because the Moor would have turned on his men too. She leapt into the longship and turned in the bow as it slid. Her eyes on his, and raised 2 fingers without ceremony, and then one, then her hand flat. He did not know what she had meant by that, and he carried the riddle like a stone in his pocket all that day. When the ship was a far shape, and then no shape at all, he sat on a rock and let himself feel the ache in his arms. His hands shook a little. Blood. Somebody's had dried on his sleeve and made the cloth stiff as bark. He looked up at the sky as if it might speak. It did not, but it bore witness in the way the sky always does, the way that is both comfort and cruelty. Toward evening, a raven came with another letter, this from Sir Roderick again, written more hurriedly, a splatter of ink like a rap on a table. He wrote that raiders had been sighted too near Winterfell for comfort, though not too near for caution. He wrote that they had set watches with bells along the tree line and braided trip lines along the stream beds the boys loved to splash in. He wrote that Bran took his dinner with the men and would not be kept to the solar when he could learn more by seeing. He wrote that Rickon had bitten a man who had laughed at him. Theon laughed when he read that and then could not stop for a moment, and the laughter made the muscles in his stomach hurt. He slept badly, and the dreams were full of water he could not drink and fires he could not reach and Robb's voice calling in a tone Theon had never heard him use. He woke to darkness, and for a moment he did not know where he was, because the dark here was not the same dark as at sea or in a great hall. This was a dry dark with roots in it. In the morning they moved again, not because the plan demanded it, but because men do not do well sitting still once they have learned to move to a purpose. They passed through a stand of pines that had a smell like new pitch, and came onto a cliff whose edge was a line drawn by a precise hand. The sea below lay flat and shining as if it had never known a storm. Theon stood with his hands in his cloak and felt the weight of what he had done and what he had not done and what he might yet do. The north breathed around him, cold and measured. The sea breathed beyond, indifferent. Between them he existed, a man made of two ways of dying and one way of living that he would have to find for himself. He placed his foot carefully at the cliff's lip and leaned forward a fraction, just to feel the wind make its claim on his balance. Then he turned inland, and his men went with him, because that is what men do when they have decided to follow for today. He would meet Asha again, and perhaps he would not hold his hand back then. He would see Winterfell's walls with his own eyes and measure them against his memory. He would go where the ravens told him to go, and where the ground allowed him. He would not count what he had not yet spent or mourn what he had not yet lost. By mid-afternoon, the ridge broadened into a flat place where scrub twisted out of grit. The clouds had lowered and gone dun, their undersides bruised. It would snow. The first flakes began to come, tentative, like scouts sent by a larger army. Theon closed his eyes and let one find his eyelid and melt there and run down. Somewhere south, in a tent warm with lamps and dog breath, Robb bent over a table. Somewhere north, in a hall warm with old stone, Bran asked Luwin a question that Luwin would answer with patience, even if he did not know he was right. On the sea, Asha watched a line of white creep over green water and told her men to pull. The world moved. In the middle of it, Theon set his hand on the hilt of his knife and felt, for once, the weight of the thing as it was, not as it had been in someone else's dream. They walked on until the light turned thin, and the snow managed at last to teach the ground the lesson it had come to teach. The flakes multiplied, and the land softened under their feet. Theon raised his face and put out his tongue like a boy to catch a leaf of sky, and laughed alone, quietly, there in the blanketing world. The laugh startled a bird from a thorn bush. It jumped and drew a line through the air like a swift ink stroke across a page. It vanished into whiteness, and Theon thought, without intending to, of the ring at White Harbor, held in a fat lord's careful hand, and of his own hand naked and marked by a circle where the gold had been. He would have it back. He would have Winterfell's trust where a ring ought to lie on a man who had not quite earned it yet. He told himself these things, not to drown the other voices, but to answer them. The men around him tramped, breathed, cursed the cold. The pines creaked. The sea muttered on his left. And the snow fell and erased the tracks of their passage as quickly as they could make them. Which was, Theon supposed, the North's way of reminding a man that he was not so important that the land should be obliged to remember his strides forever. He found this humbling and also strangely liberating. "Camp," Cregan said at last, "before the whites take our eyes." They built fires shallow and mean in pits and stretched canvas low. Theon took the watch late and sat with the snow hissing on the coals. The night fenced itself around the camp, an animal that meant only to keep its heat. He knelt there, hands extended, palms turned to meet the fire, and for a time the sound of his own breathing and the small conversation of the snow were all of the world. When the change came, it came as changes always do when a man is half asleep and the day has been long. A rhythm altered. A breath he knew was absent was present. He opened his eyes to see Wex standing just outside the fire's shadow, white on his shoulders like dust, his eyes bright under it. The boy pointed, not back the way they had come, nor toward the sea, nor inland, but up. Theon lifted his gaze. Between the branches of the firs, the sky had made a window. The snow had thinned for a heartbeat. Through the window, a star burned, not the brightest star, but a steady one. "It doesn't move," Theon whispered. Though he knew that was foolish. Everything moved. Weck's mouth quirked not quite into a smile. He put a finger to his lips as if to say, "You will wake them." And then he went away as he always did, on silent feet that the world chose not to notice. Theon lifted his hands to the small fire and let it paint him with warmth. He watched the star and thought of what moves and what does not, what kind of men stand in place, and what kind of men run, and which he had been, and which he had been, and which he would have to be if he meant to be worthy of the ring he had left, and the boy he used to be, and the friend who had said only, "You can do this." The snow thickened again and took the star away. He bowed his head and did not pray. He simply breathed until his breath became all the prayer he could manage. An hour later he heard, very far off, the call of a horn, one note, low and long. It could have been a bull seal. It could have been a shepherd moving a flock in the dark. It could have been Asha testing the air. It could have been one of his own beacons answering a light. Theon did not know. He only knew that the world was speaking to him in 100 tongues, and he would learn as many as he could before the tide came in and took the day. He put another stick on the fire, watched the snow take it, and when his watch was done and he laid himself down on the cold earth, he slept without dreams until the light came again, and with it another set of choices waiting to be made. Okay. Snow came down all day in thoughtful, drifting sheets, the kind that remembered the shape of the wind and reproduced it with patience. The men wore it in their beards and on their lashes until each blink shook off a small miracle. Theon learned again the old lesson of winter marches, that there are 1,000 ways to go numb and only a few to keep warm, and all of those involve doing something deliberately. He kept them moving in short bursts with reasons attached to each. Count the paces to that bent pine, pull the saplings for brush screens, stamp out the nests of ice that grew in the ruts where carts had once passed. Cregan moved along the line with a stick like a shepherd, tapping a boot here, a shoulder there, murmuring nothing in particular, and the right things all the same. Toward mid-afternoon, a shape wove through the flakes, more suggestion than man. Thin as a pole, yet somehow heavy. Water beaded on a leather coat, whose seams had been sealed in a way the stony shore men did not use. The spear at his back had barbs like the petals of a cruel flower. He wore a hood from which no hair escaped. His face, when he lifted it, was the color of peat where a boot had trod and new water had filled the print. His eyes were lake-dark and still. "Crannog," Cregan said under his breath, as if he had named a skittish animal. The stranger's voice had the texture of reed leaves rubbed between two fingers. "Bad men walk in the neck," he said. "They carry iron and the smell of old tar. They want the stones that make a road, and they do not love the mud that eats their ankles." He considered Theon as if Theon were a plant that might be edible if boiled twice. "One of our cousins saw your fires where the slope keeps them from the wind. I came to see if you were another kind of bad man." Theon understood that a man like this did not ask a name at once. Names were a kind of meat to be portioned. "We are Northmen who learned the sea's habit of not dying," he said. "There are ironborn on these shores and in your waters. I aim to see them get lost on their way home." The Crannog man made a small sound of agreement that could as easily have been amusement. "You speak like a man who knows that water is a road for the clever and a ditch for the proud." He stepped forward the last pace he had kept between them and scraped the snow off his spear butt on a rock with a precise disdain. "They bring a big man with a black bearded mouth and a red temper to the moat. We have watched his scouts drown more than once by accident and once or twice with help." His eyes did not move. "If you would write a letter to Reed and Fen and Frog, write it with little feet and quiet breath. Words on paper do not swim well." "Howland Reed," Theon said softly. Not as a guess, but as a memory from another boyhood under another roof. A name he had once heard spoken near a hearth as if it were a tale about the right way to pull a thorn. The Cranogman's face did not so much as flicker, which was answer and warning both. "Tell him Theon Greyjoy is in the Marsh's debt, before the debt is even written. Tell him I will pay it back with iron and with iron men." "We need not your debt," the man said mildly. "But we need your patience, if you have any. It is a strange crop to ask of a man with your smell." His gaze slid over the men behind Theon, the makeshift nets, the bundles of brush, the small, careful ways the camp had been made to be uninteresting to eyes that looked for neatness. He inclined his head a fraction. "You have learned some, then. That helps." He turned as if to leave and then looked back. If a woman with hair like wet bark and a laugh like a gull comes to a wood near you with too many friends and too few careful thoughts, do not fight her where the ground is flat and honest. Lie to her with the land. It enjoys being wicked for the right cause. "She already came," Theon said, "and left me a riddle with her fingers." He made the gestures Asha had made, 2, then 1, then a flat hand, without knowing why he told this man, only that the marsh might as well have the problem too. The crowning man watched his hand with the consideration a man gives a new kind of fish hook. 3 tides, he said. 2, full, 1/2, then slack water. She will try again between the second and third, and not where she tried the first time. Women who laugh like gulls listen to the sea better than men who shout like seals. He turned again, and this time he went, the snow taking him back molecule by molecule, until only a suggestion of a footprint remained where he had been, and even that filled with white before Theon could count to 20. Cragen blew out a breath he had not known and been holding. "I don't much like talking to the river," he said. "I prefer to hear it and be left alone." "We are not alone," Theon said. He felt the fact run down his back like cold water and decided he liked the feeling. "Send 2 men with frog spears. The smallest and quietest we have. If they do not come back, they will not be dead. They will have been taken into the reeds and taught manners. If they do come back, they will carry newsmen and plate will never hear." By the time they reached Deepwood Motte, the snow had turned the forest into a room in which the ceiling was too low. Sound got stuck in the trees and chose sly, private paths among the needles. Smoke rose in carefully managed threads from the Motte's chimneys, disciplined and dark. The palisade wore hoarfrost like silver fur. Lady Sibel Glover stood on the gatewalk, with a cloak of rough brown wool pinned at the breast with a comb that had once been carved for a lady with more time for mirrors. She did not smile. Her hair had gone to iron at the temples, and there was a nick on her cheekbone that had never quite decided whether to be a scar or a dimple. "You took your time," she said, as if she had sent him yesterday, and he had come back a minute late with wet boots. "I took the time the sea would give," Theon said. He looked at the palisade with a carpenter's eyes because a lord's eyes were too given to considering how things looked. "You cut new embrasures. We taught the old ones new angles," she said. "We made our women practice with short bows until their fingers bled, and then gave them beeswax, and told them to keep going." A thin smile then, not for him but for a memory. "They like it." Inside, deep wood smelled of wood smoke and fat, rendered down into candles, of steel rubbed with oil and wool that had dried slowly in a cold room. Children ran with jars of sand for the hearths. Men wore their beards like banners. Theon walked the inner ditch and found it deeper than he'd been taught to expect and lined with thorn that would not catch a man cleanly, but would hold him badly. He approved of that. Clean tricks were for men who wanted songs. He wanted time. They set deadfalls where the paths narrowed in the snow shadow of the inner wall, and taught boys too young for pikes to pull ropes, and then dropped them to count to a number that felt too large, and then count to it again. Theon took Wex with him to the lower storehouse, where a grate let in air from a ground tunnel long boarded over against wolves and worse. He pulled 3 planks and pushed his arm into the cold, beyond until his hair rose with the air's old damp. They would seal it again. They would unseal it once, at their time, and not another's. He could feel the shape of the defense as if it were a net on his shoulders. Weight here and there that made sense when the whole was remembered. The women with bows came to the yard in pairs and trios, coarse braids looping around their ears, cheeks flushed with work and the cold. Theon watched them loose at painted slats, and then at gourds hung on cords, and then at moving bundles dragged on strings. When one woman, small and square, cursed because the arrow had hopped low and skipped off the ice, Lady Sibel quietly took her bow and put 2 in the gourd as it swung and a 3rd in the cord. "You needn't look pretty to be right," she said, handing the bow back, and the woman laughed and spat and tried again with better aim. News came in as snow comes. Quietly and everywhere at once, if a man knows how to look. The frog spear boys did not return, but a strip of boiled leather did, floating in the trough beside the well like an eel. When Theon had it unknotted, he found a tiny roll of birch bark inside with a drawing done in soot, and spit so delicate, it looked like the memory of a drawing. 3 rafts lashed together with a hearth in their middle, a cluster of squares that might be iron-edged shields, the marks for reeds, and the soft suggestion of 3 men walking where the ground would not hold a boot print. On the other side, a single smear of black, with a little point pressed into one end. The crow's eye sigil drawn without an eye, or else a careless seabird. He stared at it and thought of storms that had fathers. Kragan frowned, thumb at his mouth. Victarion at the moat, he said. Asha at the edges. Dagmar in the middle, I'd wager. Pulling on your old strings. Mems. You can't pull where a man has taken the knots out, Theon said. But he said it softly, and to convince himself as much as the men who listened. The Ironborn came before dawn, because time likes to mock men who plan around light. Theon's eyes were full of sleep grit when the first bell muttered. He rolled to his feet and put his hands through the motions of arming, while his mind lined up. Snowtongue kissed the palisade and slid down in slow stalactites. The moon skated thin behind cloud. He climbed to the walk, and the night delivered him the shapes he had expected. A small party came straight for the gate, too few for an assault, just enough to take advantage of a latch unbarred through habit or fear. Another moved along the western ditch in a crouch, ropes coiled like snakes. The third, the one that mattered, kept well back, not moving at all, waiting to be told how clever to be. He used the deadfalls where he could, not by dumping all at once, but by choosing which ropes to loose in what order. A figure went down, legs tangled in thorns, and his friend went to help and got a branch for his trouble, because men were kind at the worst moments, and the land was not. The women at the parapet shot in good rhythm. The yard behind Theon moved like a throat swallowing, fetching arrows, wetting the bowstrings, setting torches where smoke would blind rather than reveal. The old tunneled air came into the storehouse and made a cold that bit their ankles. He set 2 boys to ladle water against the inner side of the gate at his mark. When he gave it, the water turned the gate logs to iron in the cold, locking them to themselves in a fit of winter that iron crowbars could not easily contradict without time and noise. A rope. No, 2. Snicked over the palisade near the western corner. That was the number he'd wanted. 3 was too many, 1 too few to commit. He nodded, and the 2 men he had stationed below with knives that had been kept hidden put their blades up under the arms of the first Ironborn, who came cat quiet on the cords. The man never knew that the palisade would be a throat for him. The second man cut his own line and dropped with a sound like a sack of grain. He landed badly and rolled and came up fast and hit a guard with the hook of his axe. Theon had expected one to get through. He moved at him with a kind of relief in his chest, because once the guessing is done, work begins. The Ironborn was older, hair braided back with little copper beads greased against the weather. His eyes widened when Theon's blade took his sleeve and the skin beneath it, and then narrowed again when he recognized the man who held the knife. "Welp," he grunted. His breath steamed. "Back to heel already?" "I learned a new master," Theon said. And the man laughed once and tried to step inside his arm, because those who had taught Theon had also taught this man. Theon shifted sideways, boot heel finding the notch he had scraped into the walkway yesterday for this purpose. He stopped there, let the Ironborn's weight come, turned him on the rail with his hip, and let physics be his second blade. The man's hand shot for Theon's wrist and found Weck's knife instead. Theon had not heard the boy arrive. That happened often. The Ironborn jerked, made a sound like a seal struck with a club, and was gone into the bitter drift below. Theon did not watch him fall. Down on the path, a woman's voice rose, and he knew the shape of it instantly, even though he could not hear the words. The men around it moved as if pulled by cords, and the cords were in her hand. He stepped to the ladder and went down fast, boots tanging on the rungs. He met her in the slice of space between the ditch and the inward slope, where the thorn had been cut last summer. Frost made their boots honest. She had her axe. He had his knife. She saw him and grinned again, but the grin had winter's humor in it. You've made yourself a hedge, Asha said, and set yourself to be the hedgehog inside it. It suits you. Bristles instead of courage. Courage is a thin soup when you're cold, Theon said. He did not smile. He was not certain his mouth remembered how when it was this cold. Warm yourself back on your ship, sister. I won't tell them on Bear Island you came and left unblooded. And then? Bear Island will tell you when it needs you to speak for it. She said. It will likely be never. Now, shall we dance for show, or shall we do something useful and stop a few of our men bleeding to decorate Lady Glover's ditch? He could have taken her at her words. Hold, parley, an exchange of prisoners. He could have tried to seize her, and the attempt would have eaten men. He paused long enough to make the pause mean something. Call them back a spear's cast, he said at last. I'll set mine to the same. Then we'll see whether words can move snow. Asha lifted 2 fingers. He watched her men obey the way a man watches a horse that has been trained with sugar and a whip, both. He nodded to Kragan, and the Stony Shore men moved too, slow and neat, like a tide going out because the moon had ordered it. In the small breathing space that opened, Asha leaned her weight on her axe haft and tilted her head. I remember when you could not keep your feet on these slopes, she said. You ran and bounced and bit your tongue and cried and then pretended you had not cried at all. Theon let the memory touch him and pass. I learned to ride in snow where trees know how to throw a man. I learned to hunt on ice so thin it sang in the mornings. You think I forgot the song because the summer was kind to me once. You learned to laugh like them, she said softly. For the first time there was no weapon in it. I do not fault you for that. I like their laughter better than ours, most days, though ours is sharper and cuts a better slice of meat. She looked past him to the palisade. You will make a fight here. You will win some and lose some. Our uncle will take your marsh if you let him. Our father will praise himself whether he wins or not. And what will you be when all the shouting is done? Ben. A man who did not betray the men who warmed him when I had no family but dog and hearth, he said. The words surprised him again, not because he did not believe them, but because they had been waiting to be said. He felt lighter when they were out. He saw her feel it too, as if she had thrown something and watched its arc. There is a ring in White Harbor, he added, for no good reason except the truth had begun to feel like a string that, once pulled, should be pulled again. I mean to earn it back. Asha's mouth bent. Lord Merman with his pearl eyes and his fat, clever hands, she said. He will sell you your ring with a smile and make you thank him for the price. She straightened, and the axe came easy to her shoulder again, as if gravity had remembered her. I came to measure you. I have measured you. I will go and warn another man that there is a hedgehog to the west that bites. You could unteach him the taste for hedgehog, Theon said. Victarion knows only one soup. Tell him there are other fires. Then, we do not teach our uncles, she said, and now the knife was back in her voice, and in her eyes the sea's old patience. We outlive them, or we die quicker. I mean to do the first. She raised 2 fingers, then 1, then her hand flat, and this time she nodded at the move as if granting a small and private prize. 3 tides, brother, she said. You learned the riddle. Use it. Then she turned, and the men who followed her did it without her needing to see them do it. And they were gone into the snow like thoughts a man refuses to keep because they will harm him if he lets them stay. The rest of the day was mending and counting, and the sound of men not talking because their throats had decided words were not as useful as breath. Theon walked the ditch and put his hand on a shoulder here and there. He let Lady Sybil set him to the small tasks a commander does when he wants to be seen. Smiling at a boy's cut, praising a woman's neat arrow, taking a cup of broth, and making a show of its worth. He slept at dusk like a man who had dug a trench with his eyelids. At darkfall, a rider came with a lathered pony and a face that had not yet learned when to be afraid. He wore the colors of Torrens Square, and his mouth tried to hold too many words at once. Theon took him aside and fed him a thin stew, and shook the words loose like grain in a bag. Dagmar, the boy said. Dagmar at the square. He sits outside with a fire and a song and men enough to look more than he is. Sir Roderick means to go out and sting him for his pains. Besandawa. Theon closed his eyes. In the darkness behind them he saw the ruined grin of the old reaver who had taught him how to stand in a longship without falling, as if he had taught him how to stand in the world. There was affection in the picture, and the knowledge that the man who had taught him to balance had also taught him to break what he could not take. He means to pull Roderick out into a bad road and run his feet off, or lead him away from Winterfell for a worse thing to be done there, Theon said. I know that trick because I have had it explained to me at length with a hand on my ear. Lady Sabelle's mouth had gone thinner than ink. Go, she said. I can have the palisade without your nose so long as the bowstrings hold. Roderick will listen or he won't, but either way, I'd prefer you were there telling him the reasons. Bow. Cragen stood when Theon looked at him and rolled one shoulder as if to make a point to a horse. If we ride hard, and the gods do not throw too many trees at us, we can make Torrhen's Square by tomorrow night. We ride, Theon said. He touched Weck's arm, and the boy was there at his stirrup when the horse was brought. He had no saddle of his own, so Theon pulled him up behind him as he had done when the boy had first come to him in Pike's wet alleys, and Wex wrapped his arms around Theon's waist lightly, as a thought a man does not want to admit he is having. The ride was cold and fast, and the snow came in bursts like temper. The ponies from the stony shore did their patient miracles. They found paths under the snow that larger horses would have insisted did not exist, and did not forgive riders who doubted them. They crossed small streams by listening to where the water sounded thin, and forced the horses on when their ears laid back against the promise of ice. Foxfire burned in 3 stumps near a bend that Theon would have missed if a woman named Arnold had not reached forward and caught his sleeve and pointed. He blessed her with a wordless sound. She spat and pretended not to be pleased. They smelt smoke before they saw light. Fat green wood smoke full of confidence and waste. The line of the trees parted, and Torrhen's Square showed itself, a squat, stubborn shape, with square towers that refused to be turned into anything prettier by snow. On the far side of the frozen fields, fires burned in neat circles, and men sat around them in the way of men who wanted to see more than they are. Theon felt a familiar disgust. A reaver without a ship is a blunt knife. Sir Roderick's beard was whiter than the last time Theon had seen it, and longer too, as if he had let it grow the way a man lets worry grow, when he has no time for razors. His eyes were sharp as a dog's when it hears the wrong footstep on a stair. He stood in the yard with a dozen men around him, and 3 boys too young for anything but watching from the shadows, which is often what boys do best. He took Theon's arm in a grip hard enough to announce old friendship, and then enough harder to declare old grievances lived in that house as well. You run to us, he said. Good. If you had ridden past my gate with the iron on your breath and your father's plan in your pocket, I would have shot your horse out from under you before you reached the second oak, and I would have apologized to the horse with better words than you'd have gotten. I came to keep you from letting Dagmar choose where you bleed, Theon said. He wants you to chase him onto a slope he's hollowed like a gourd, or he wants you to leave Bran with fewer men than he has now, and less patience. Roderick's brow drew down. Bran is not alone, he said. And the boys have Summer and Shaggydog besides. There are guards on the walls and dogs in the yard and Osha in every room I cannot see. His mouth flexed. I do not say this because I trust to wolves, Theon. That would be a child's hope. I say it because I count men, and because there are only so many roads into Winterfell a rider can take if he wants to arrive before his horse dies. You taught me to count men, Theon said. I am only returning the lesson. He gestured. If you must go to Dagmar, go with feet, not hooves. Go at night with men who do not love horns and torches, and break his fires with your hands, not your banner. If you go in pride, he will take your pride and make court of it to pull something worse. Bando. Roderick grunted, which Theon had learned was the sound a man makes when the thing you tell him is the thing he knows but does not like. You know him, Roderick said after a moment. You know where he will put his foot if I step one way, and where if I step another. He will not put both in the same place, Theon said. He respects his ankles more than his men's heads. They agreed then on a pattern as old as war, and as reliable as the habits of certain kinds of men. Theon took 2 score along the tree line and in among the ditch hedges where the drifts had made new shapes. Cregan left 6 on their bellies with lengths of blackened rope and torches to be lit so late, the men with the torches would have frost curled on their eyelashes. Inside the square, Rodrik measured out his answer in slow movements. Half a gate opened, then closed. A horse led out to wander with bells on its bridle, so that the sound would tangle the Ironborn's sleep. A cask of strong small beer rolled off a cart, near where men outside could see it, and believe there were more where that came. Deep night changed the sound of everything. A horse's snort became an oath, the crack of ice a broken blade. Dagmar sent a handful of men first, because he had been at this longer than Theon had been alive, and would not trip on a yard-long route without kicking it first to hear the sound it made. The handful went down in the ditch where thorn had been packed with snow to make a sort of deceitful cushion. A second handful went in after them because men cannot help generosity in these matters. Then Dagmar came himself behind a screen of planks held high, and then the rest came with him because Ironborn loved a show and a story, and their old hero in the night was both. The torches went up along the hedge where Cregan's 6 lay and set the world to flicker. The light made the drifts into shapes that eyes could argue about. Theon moved in that argument, and where the men around him breathed steam, he made his breath small. They hit the flank of Dagmar's screen where the planks met badly and found the seam a careless man had left for them. Theon was face to face with his old teacher for the first time since boyhood, and for 2 beats of his heart he was a boy again, and then he wasn't. Dagmar's half-mouth, half-scar opened into a grin, as if the night itself had told him a joke. "Bastard whelp," he said, fond and disgusted all at once. "I learned," Theon said, "and they fought. There is no gallantry in killing a man who taught you how to kill. There is only the precise wrongness of the angles being familiar." The old Reaver's strength had not gone. He put it where Theon would have put it if he had been more perfect, and Theon took what blows he had to take and turned others away with his borrowed center of gravity and the thin strip of steel that had been his since he left the Greenlands. Twice Dagmar stepped in the direction he wanted Theon to think he preferred, and twice Theon made himself follow the shadow of the movement instead, and found the real blow waiting with less speed and more intent. It did not last long. These things seldom do. Cregan's men broke 2 of the planks. A boy with too big a helm got his head stuck between 2 thorns and howled, and the sound pulled men's attention, the way small misery always does. Theon shoved his knife into the space under Dagmar's rib where even a man like that keeps something tender, and then he moved around behind his teacher and took his knee with a kick. He pushed the old man down as gently as a man might ease a friend into sleep. It broke his heart twice in one breath, and also satisfied something in him that had wanted, for years, to be not the pupil, but the man with the lesson. "Bind him," he said, not trusting his voice to be anything other than steady. The ropes went on with the respectful roughness men use on a bull that might, against habit, kick. Dagmar spat and wheezed, and then laughed again, because he was still Dagmar even with winter in his mouth. "I'll see you at table yet," he said. "Your father sits at a long one under the sea. He'll save you a seat to his left." "My father eats alone," Theon said, which was both true and not. "White Harbor will keep you on porridge and stories until you forget the taste of salt." He turned away because it was kindness. By dawn, the Ironborn outside the square had lost the shape of their courage and found another shape for it. Stubborn, low, scurrying. They took their wounded and their pride and moved off in that weary, purposeful way that men move when they are not running, but are aware that they are not welcome. Rodrik stood on the gatewalk with his gloved hands on the crenels and did not call insults after them, because he had never been that kind of man, and did not intend to begin now that his beard had gone white. He looked at Theon and nodded once, the nod that says we will speak when there is a room and a fire. They spoke in a small room that had once been a winter pantry, and was now a place where men with maps admitted their mistakes and tried to make better ones. A pot of oats, steamed with something that might have been honey in it, if a man was fanciful. Rodrik sat with his back to the hearth and made sure Theon had the good stool that did not wriggle. He put his hands on his knees and leaned forward until the heat had found him through his mail. "You kept me from doing something proud and therefore stupid," he said. He was not a man to fumble with a thing once he had decided to hold it. "I am in your debt, and the debt is to the north as much as to me." If I had taken horse last night, we would be here still perhaps, but with worse news from the south gate and fewer arrows on the parapet. You'd have turned him, Theon said, because there was no profit and little honor in overclaiming a victory. But he would have chosen the ground, and a man who chooses ground does not much care about the shape of the enemy on it. Roderick's eyes softened for a breath. Balin will not stop, because his nephew went to bed hungry, he said. Victarion will be at the moat soon, if he is not standing in the marsh already cursing at leeches. I have sent to Greywater Watch with words and to castle and town with others. If you mean to go where the men count for little and the ground counts for much, I will give you a letter with my seal and my name, and a paragraph in which I say that I trust your sight, even when it does not please me. Men? The letter was written in a hand neat as floorboards, sealed with wax that smelled faintly of tallow and sweet oil. Theon tucked it inside his doublet and felt it there like a kept promise. He slept 3 hours and woke with his body angry at him for asking it to be a horse again. He made it be a horse anyway. He left Dagmar under guard with 2 men he trusted to be firm and uninterested in stories, and he rode south and east with Cragen and Wex, and the woman with the stringer-line scar, and another 10 who had learned to be invisible in their own land. The ground between Torrhen Square and the neck softened and changed its mind about being land 2 or 3 times a mile. Trees became pole-thin, bark the color of drowned men. The air went from dry cold to a moist old chill that remembered fish. The pony's breath made ghosts that did not disperse as quickly. Theon felt his own sweat decide to be something else and leave his body as a kind of education. They dismounted where the reeds began and led the ponies to a place that did not look like a place at all until a hand came out of it and took the reins, and a voice said, "If a hoof goes where I don't tell it, it will not come out with the rest of the horse attached." They went on foot into the green-brown world, where sound did not carry and smell was king. The Crannogmen moved like ideas through a man's head, quick and without friction. Theon learned to step where they stepped without being told. Wex, who had the gift the marsh loves, vanished into a clump of sedge and then reappeared on the other side of a hummock without having set foot on anything anyone else could see. Cragen went ankle-deep and did not swear because swearing wastes breath while the mud is counting. They came at last to a place where the reeds opened into a sheet of water that had opinions about the sky. Out on its face, 3 rafts moved slowly, ropes trailing from their corners like lazy tails. On the middle raft, men had built a fire and boiled a pot of something that smelled of cabbage and an unwise amount of salt. Beyond them, where the water became less water and more suggestion, he saw the shadowy curve of a low stone rampart that used to be a wall, and now was a bruise the land remembered reluctantly. Black birds stood on it like notes. Theon thought of songs he did not know. Victarion's men wore their armor as if it was argument enough, which in many places it would have been. Here, it was a promise to drown. They moved carefully and not carefully enough. The rafts made sucking sounds where the ropes rubbed through peat. A horn blew, not to signal, but to reassure itself. On the left-hand raft, a man with a beard forked into twin oil slicks prodded the water with a pole and swore in a voice so weary of its own vocabulary that Theon almost felt sorry for it. "Howland Reed is not here," said the Crannogman who had first come to them in the snow. He had been with them all the way, appearing and disappearing like common sense, and Theon had stopped being surprised. But his sister's sons are, and their friends, and 2 men who have never left the marsh in their lives. And me. He did not bother with pride. He had the marsh. We will not fight the big one in the iron. He is a man for another day. We will teach his friends to be suspicious of water that looks like land. He looked at Theon sideways. The look a man gives a river to see whether it intends to rise. If you would like to practice lying, this is where to do it. They began with sound. Frogs in a jar croaked when the lid was lifted and the jar set in a particular place. The sound came from the wrong corner of the eye. Birds in a sack were let loose to explode in 3 directions at once and make the reeds talk. A lantern with a wick turned low, and fat was set on a tiny raft and sent, so slowly, away into a patch of green that could not hold it. And when the Ironborn tried to wade to fetch it, The ground gave them a lesson about gravity and patience together. The first went into his thigh, then his hip. The second went into his knee, then his belly when he tried to pull the first. The third stood and watched, and did nothing intelligent with the information. A fourth, laughing, took a long stride to show the others a better way, and found the only hole within 5 yards that would eat him to the armpits. They used arrows smeared with rot and tied with tiny pebbles, so that they fell short, demoralizing without killing, an insult more than a wound. They waited until a raft came too near a clump of grass that had been cut and replaced with something that looked like grass and wasn't. The raft tilted, and half of the men on it left dignity behind. They chose their moments with the greedy care of men who had few arrows and fewer good shots to waste. Theon's fingers itched for his bow and to feel the rightness of pull and release. But he waited and watched, and cut a rope when a crannogman touched his wrist and nodded. He learned that the marsh is a world you can only inherit, not conquer. But if the heirs like you, they will let you visit and show you what hurts. By noon, the Ironborn had lost good men and bad shoes, and had gained a respect for water that was useful to their survival and insulting to their honor. The bearded man with the forked oil slicks on his chin shouted at the men on the other rafts and shook a fist at the air, because that is who men shout at when there is no one to blame without making your own god laugh. The biggest of them was not there. Victarion rarely came to the front unless the front was ship's kissing, and in this kissing there was too little wood and too much earth under the lip. "We let them go," the crannogman said. "We like it when men go away and tell stories that keep other men from coming." He looked at Theon. "But we could also hurt them more if your wolves are hungry." "My wolves are always hungry," Theon said, thinking of Robb in his southern camp, making himself a king a piece of paper at a time, of Bran with a quill held like a knife, of Rickon with teeth and no patience. But a hungry wolf hunts better if he is not fed nonsense. He nodded toward the rafts. "Let them go without a trophy, and let a rumor be enough. I will take other meat." "What meat?" the crannogman asked. "The ropes," Theon said. "Cut half the ropes on their rafts tonight when the moon is watching and their pride is sleeping. Leave the other half. When the tide turns and the wind decides to have a joke, they'll learn what it means to be attached to less than you thought." He was smiling, and he did not find himself ashamed of that. Sometimes mischief was a righteous work. He sent Wex with the Frog Spear boys into a world so dark it felt like shut eyes. He had to sit on his own hands. He wanted to go, but the marsh had shown him the rules, and one was that a tall man with a wolf on his chest should not be a shadow when the shadows were small and thin. He contented himself with listening. A reed brushed by a body, the chuff of a satisfied frog, a trickle of something that was not water falling into water. When Wex came back, he came without a sound and held up his fingers, too, then made a pulling gesture and let his hand go limp. Theon nodded and felt the ghost of old pride try to climb back onto his shoulders and ride him around like a pony. And he reached back, gently, and took it by the mane and put it down on the ground and told it to stay. They left the neck with the smell of peat fire in their clothes. The wind from the north was cleaner and cut more honestly. Along the way, a courier found them, breath puffing like a kettle, and handed Theon a packet bound in green thread and wax stamped with a merman. He broke the seal and found his ring wrapped in cloth torn from a child's shirt. There was a note from Lord Wyman that read in a neat, outrageous hand, "A man who goes where he ought to go and returns the better for it may have back the thing that says he belongs to good memories. Return the cloth to its owner when you pass this way, and tell him to keep his fingers out of candle flames. He is 12 and does not know anything." Theon slid the ring onto his finger. It fit the way a thing fits when a man has gone through something to deserve it, tight at first, and then settling as if it had been waiting for him to stop lying. He held it against his chest for a beat, felt the cold of it, and let that cold be a promise as much as a comfort. He passed close enough to Winterfell to smell its smoke in the air, the recognizable tang of oak from the godswood fires. He went to the drawbridge and stood while the guards on the wall called down his name, and then he stood longer while they went to fetch someone who had the authority to do more than call. When he entered the yard, he felt the place change him the way a river changes a man who steps into it, up to the waist. It was partly the past grabbing his knees, and partly the stone taking his weight, and deciding it did not object. Bran waited for him in the solar, feet barely touching the floor when he sat, the great chair making him look smaller than he was, and then, in some trick of light, reminding Theon of every Stark who had leaned there and was not small at all. Sir Roderick stood by the window, and Maester Luwin was a warm candle in a corner, his chain clinking with the quiet vanity of a man who had earned his medal. Osha sat on the floor by Bran's chair, plaiting something out of leather, and not looking up and seeing everything. "You smell like marsh," Bran said without preface. And Theon laughed because it was exactly what a Stark boy would say to a man who had come from saving his land from men who thought themselves immortal. "Did you bring frogs? Rickon wants a frog." "I brought stories," Theon said. "They have bigger legs than frogs, and you roast them the same way." He bowed, not to the chair nor the notion of a lord in it, but to the boy. "We are pricking your enemies at Moat Cailin, and the Marsh allies like you better than they thought they would." He told the tale in a way that let Bran see himself in it, without making the boy think he had done the work. It was a trick Theon had learned from men who taught boys to be killers and not braggarts. He watched the light in Bran's eyes change and settle. He watched Sir Roderick's mouth do a small thing that looked like pride and worry sharing a piece of bread. "Winterfell holds," Osha said at last from the floor. "Holds and breathes, which is more than some do when the sea comes calling. I told them you'd come with your hackles up, Greyjoy. I told them you were a dog who'd fetch for the boy king. I was wrong." She looked up, and her eyes were old and not cruel. "You're not a dog. You're a man who decided the hand that fed him didn't have to do it a second time to count. That's rarer." "Them? Spare me praise," Theon said, "because it felt too much like something you put in your mouth and could not swallow without coughing. Give me food and a bed for a day, and men who know how to stand ankle deep and not curse when the cold eats them. Then show me where you think the next mouthful will come for our enemies." They gave him those things. He ate plain and well. He slept like a stone that had been dropped into a jar of oats and shaken, and then set down. He woke to Bran coming in without ceremony just after dawn, because boys who mean to be men learn to make other men live at their timing. They stood together in the godswood with frost on the red leaves, and a light as thin as shaved bone. The face on the heart tree was as unreadable as it had always been, which was what made it useful. A god who looks like men do is more work than help. "You came back," Bran said. He said it as a fact that did not need thanks. "I'm not done," Theon said. "You will keep breathing while I'm away." "I will," Bran said. And the wind shook the leaves as if someone had laughed where men could not hear. Summer patted from shadows, a memory of brindled fur and breath, and put his head against Bran's hip in a weight that would have knocked another boy sideways. Bran's hand found the warm place behind the wolf's ear without looking. Theon thought of Grey Wind's breath in a different yard, and the way Robb had set his foot like a man who knew the shape of the step to follow. When he left Winterfell again, he did not look back, because a man who knows the land knows not to teach his feet to slow when his head turns. He took the eastward track, then cut north again to see the sea behave as the Crannogman had promised it would. Reluctant in the west, eager in the east, respecting no man's schedule. He thought of Asha's fingers counting tides, and he weighed the days left before she would try again at Deepwood. She would not waste herself on the Moat twice the same way. She would go for bear meat, because bear meat makes good stories for men who want to boast when they get home. He sent riders along the beach with bells hidden in their saddles to make sound where no man showed, and he sent others inland with no bells and orders to talk to anyone who carried a net, and he went himself to a cliff the wind had carved into a chair, and sat in it and closed his eyes and listened for the particular language of the sea that meant long ships. The weather answered first, a line of iron on the horizon under cloud that had learned a bad habit. Gulls talk to one another in the stupid, sensible way of birds that know where food will be tomorrow, because it is where it was today. Far out, a thin darkness moved that did not belong to cloud or wave. Theon counted without using numbers, with something older in him. He rose and went down the cliff's goat path, with the precision of a man who has not decided exactly how he will survive, but has decided for certain that he will not die by turning his ankle. They met Asha the second time on a strand, the color of a dirty coin. She had landed farther north and had the wind on her side and the sense to let it fight for her. She had more men than before and fewer torches. The woman did not repeat mistakes within the same moon. Theon had a dozen from the moat and 24 from the shore and a handful of men out of White Harbor who wore short knives at their wrists and knew what to do with a mouth of rope. The first rush of Ironborn found nothing to fight but the idea of resistance. The second found wicker cages where there had not been any yesterday. The third found the cages were empty because Theon had filled them with cold smoke an hour ago, and the Ironborn could not help but cough and give the signal for arrows to come like rain. They had taken the habit of being lured and made it a discipline without meaning to. Asha herself came on foot because the sand was wrong that day for running under a horse, and she kept her axe low and used her shoulders like a sailor uses the wind. Theon met her as if the beach had sent him, and for a span, there was quiet in the fight around them because men like to watch a story when they know they will be asked to repeat it later by a fire. Neither of them wasted time. She fainted low because she had seen him watch her hands, and he knew it. He stepped into it, because stepping back teaches your legs, to teach your heart, to teach your head, the wrong things. When wood met steel, it was like spoken honesty, bracing and unwelcome. "Tell father," she said between breaths, "that he has one child who knows how to use the tide. You tell him." Theon said, "He listens to you more when he is angry." They did not finish. Fights like this do not finish unless men become wolves or poetry, and neither of them had time for that. The sound to the north changed, an ululation not of men on a ship, but of women on a shore. The Bear Island boats had come around the headland with their square little sails defiant against the day. They rode higher in the water than Ironborn longships and bit harder into it, and the women in them stood with bows that did not need witness. The first volley came in clean, the wind on its side, and pinned 2 men to the same idea. The idea that you can run on a beach and count your steps the way you counted them yesterday. Eliza Mormont stood in her prow with her hair braided back as if it meant to hold her skull together in a fight, and shouted something Theon could not hear but felt in the way the men around him suddenly had more spine. Asha swore like a delight. "I hate bears," she said cheerfully. "They are too simple to bribe." She stepped back 2 paces, sucked in a breath, and whistled a note that pulled her men like a string pulls a kite. The longship at the outer bar turned its nose with a grace that made Theon ache for the deck underfoot. She pointed, and her men obeyed, and in 2 scores of heartbeats they were water again and not land, and the bears and the wolves and the shoremen and the White Harbor knives stood with their breath in their throats and watched them go because even the best swimmers have the sense not to chase fish. Elizan came up the beach when the longship had become a neat insult on the horizon and clapped Theon on the shoulder, hard enough to move him a finger's breadth in the sand. "You stink less of sea than I expected," she said by way of greeting. "Good. We do not trust men who bring the god of the waves to our door. We have our own monsters and feed them fine." "And well, I'm glad to be found acceptable," Theon said. He meant it, and his voice had no room for wit just then. "You came when you were needed. We live where need is a neighbor," she said. "It has a noisy wife." She looked at the cages, at the women with bows on the palisade line where the sand became scrub, at the knot of men out of White Harbor, who were busy in the precise way of men proud of a job that keeps them from thinking. "Send word to your king that the bears are fat and angry and will bite ships if they have to. Tell him we want our share of the bone." "Bah. You'll have it," Theon said, because the bears would take it whether or not he promised it. And it was always better to put your word between a hungry woman and what she intended to take. "And tell your island that Deepwood stands. Deepwood stands because the trees have lean women under them," she said. "Men help when they do not get in the way." She grinned, and the grin was not Asha's, and not like any man's. It was bare. "You fought your sister and did not die. That is either brave or stupid, and I like either if it keeps my nieces in their beds at night." They parted with camaraderie hammered thin but strong. Theon returned to the Mahdi and found Lady Sabel speaking drill to a boy whose hands were raw and whose eyes had decided they wanted to learn. He stood and watched, because there are some small beauties men should not interrupt. He slept an hour at noon and did not dream. He wrote on a scrap of birch for the marsh, "Thanks," and pushed it into a hollow post where someone else would find it. He ate fish baked in clay and had grit between his teeth, and did not complain because the grit made him remember he was eating ashore and keeping it. By and by, the snow broke and the sky showed its color, which had never changed, though men insist on thinking it does when their hearts do. Ravens came and went with news that always tasted of iron and paper. Robb held the Lannisters at an arm's length and bit their fingers when they reached. Tywin moved like an old river that did not need to rush to drown a man in a cave. At the moat, Victarion had learned to stand on planks and wait longer between curses. 2 rafts had gone adrift. 3 men had disappeared between reed clumps and never showed at the lower bar. There were stories about that now, and stories do some of the work bows do if you tell them with the right voice. In all of it, Theon moved with a sense that the land and the sea together were teaching him how to be something he did not have a word for yet. He had put his feet in the right places often enough that the ground allowed him not to fall when he misstepped. He had made himself mean to his old love, the longship's deck, and she had not forgiven him, but she had not punished him yet either. He wrote a letter to Robb on an evening when the light was the color of old pewter, and told him the thing his mother had told him to write himself. "Don't die?" He added, "I am not dying either. I am too busy." He sealed it with the ring that had come back to him, and felt again the little bite of the metal as it made a wolf in wax. That night, alone for the first time in days, he went to the scrub at the edge of the headland and sat. The sea moved its heavy shoulder against the rocks, and the sound was the sound of someone thinking. He spoke aloud then, and he did not pretend it was a prayer, and he did not pretend it wasn't. "I am here," he said to the dark and the wind, and the absent faces he would not name, because naming them would bring them too close. "I am doing the thing I should have done sooner. I will do it again tomorrow. If you have a debt against me, get in line." The wind did not answer. The sea did not condescend. A fox moved through the gorse and made no sound because it had a right to be there and did not need to declare it. Theon laughed once quietly because he had begun to feel the same way. He stood, brushed sand from his knees, and went to sleep without a story because he had lived enough of one for that day. Morning brought him work. Afternoon, more work. Evening, the promise of work on the morrow. It was a kind of peace. He would have chosen it sooner, he thought, if someone had told him it felt like this. He thought of Asha's fingers counting tides and of a star caught between fir branches, of Robb's margin note, of a ring in a fat lord's hand and on his own. He thought of Bran and a chair too big for him and not big enough, and of Dagmar's laugh, and of the marsh's sly patience. He thought of all these at once and felt briefly like a man standing on 2 boats tied together, and then he shifted his feet until the boats chose to be the same boat, and he did not fall. When word came that Victarion had lost patience and meant to force the moat with a wall of shields and a Bible of curses, Theon felt the old quickening in him that said, "Ah, now, here is where you spend your breath. Here is where you throw your shoulder." He gathered men with boots that did not mind being wet forever, and women whose arrows had learned humility. He sent to the crannogman with a fishhook braid and a bit of red-dyed thread, because that is how you write a letter there. And he took again the road that is not a road, in a season that does not like roads, to a place that was once a hinge, on which the north swings and is now a patient misery that forgives no one. He could feel in his bones that this was the turn of a thing, the kind of day a man will lay his cheek against years later, and check whether it is warmer than it was. As he went, snow began again, lightly, not like a warning, but like an old friend tapping his shoulder. He smiled into it and did not adjust his cloak. He had adjusted enough things in himself for 1 year. He would adjust the rest as the tide demanded. For now, the marsh waited. The iron waited in men's hands. The wolves waited in boys' dreams. The bears waited in their boats. Theon Greyjoy moved among them with the care of a man who has learned what breaks and what bends and which part of him he can afford to put where. He moved, and the world noticing, made a slight accommodation, the way a good chair shifts under the right weight and decides not to creak. Ka. The marsh gathered itself into a patient beast beneath a sky the color of old iron. Men who had never loved water learned its moods the way a child learns his father's, with equal measures of fear and fascination, and the knowledge that nothing he did would change the larger shape of the thing. Theon found he could walk in silence for 100 heartbeats and hear more in the reeds than he had heard in a day of men talking. Snipe lifting like thrown needles, a muskrats pushed through green water, the long, wet breath of mud adjusting under weight. The crannogmen moved without disturbing any of it, as if the marsh had dreamt them and would not wake just to watch them pass. They brought him to a spoil of dry under-alder, where a woven screen made shadows do what small useful lies do in a council chamber, suggest without insisting. The hummock had a view over a black runnel the Ironborn had taken to calling a channel, though the marsh did not approve of the term. Beyond, the stones of the moat rose in stutters and ribs, all that remained of a giant spine the land had once thrust up in pride, and then allowed to sink slowly back into its bed. Crow-black birds drifted along the broken curtain like thoughts that preferred this world to another. He saw Victarion's camp as a geometry of bad decisions, laid down on the only parts of the neck that would accept geometry. Planks made straight where the world liked curves. Fires placed where smoke would carry. Shields raised against arrows that would not fly because the wind had nowhere honest to go. Theon marked the rafts again. 3 lashed floats with a hearth set between 2 of them for boasts and soup, ropes trailing like the tails of lazy beasts. The Ironborn had learned to move them with poles and curses, and were beginning to learn patience, which was as close to defeat as men like that knew. "Wait," said the crannogman who had become his habit of information. A man whose name Theon had not asked, because some names insist on asking you in return. They will do something stupid when the afternoon asks them to. The afternoon is a fine ally that way. It came on cue, with the petulance of a day that believes it has been neglected. A squad made of men too restless for thinking and too well born for the tasks at hand, decided to be heroic, which in the neck meant deciding to stand on a piece of ground that the neck had not promised would be there a moment later. They came with planks on shoulders and ropes looped like trophies, eye holes on their helms cut to look fierce, and only succeeding in looking surprised. Theon watched them advance a little way and stopped to admire their work. He leaned his forearms on the woven screen and felt the wet chill of the fibers through his sleeves. "Now," he said, and the crannogman ghosted outward the way wind comes out of reeds when it means to become a voice. A lantern bobbed where no man was, its wick turned low and fat to bleed smoke. Somewhere a sack loosened, and 3 mallards exploded from it in outrage, taking a noise with them. A drumhead far back in the Ironborn camp made a single uncertain thrum that told nothing, and therefore told the truth. The men with planks took 2 steps forward to look, the way men do when curiosity is trying on bravery's coat. The marsh let the first one keep his right leg and eat the left to the thigh. The second made the mistake of brotherhood and reached for him. The third made the mistake of pride and lunged to show both how a proper man manages peat and gravity. The fourth listened, blessed be his name, and stood still. An arrow with a napped head and a smear of something honest and foul thumped into the plank between his boots. It did not pierce it. It said, "Stay." He stayed. "Give them a way out," Theon said quietly. "No more than one. Men who have 2 will choose the wrong one out of habit." A cord which had seemed part of the reed snagged a loop and became briefly a hand. A pole offered itself. A path appeared, 1 step, then 2, then none. The marsh would not give more at once. Theon watched the Ironborn do the arithmetic. Shame versus drowning, story versus death. Shame won with difficulty. He saw a face he knew. Harmon Stonebeard, who had once held Theon's head under a tub and called it a blessing, and watched him go to his knees and cry out without using the drowned gods' names even once. A crannogman reached a rope toward him. Stonebeard struck at it with the back of his hand and spat black water, and while he was spitting the marsh made up his mind for him, and the rope went round his chest, and the hands behind it pulled like a well bucket hauled by cousins. Victarion himself stood on the nearest chunk of sound land, with a cloak that had once been red now the color of argument. His helm was off, because a man in that much iron, in that much wet, does not bait his own neck. He had the brow of a cliff and the gaze of a ship's prow. It went over the marsh in a slow, wide path, and found nothing to be angry at that. Did not belong to the world. Theon could hear his voice in memory without hearing it in fact. Blunt as a cudgel, tireless as a man who has never had to grow cunning, because the gods had given him bulk. Make him fear a thing he cannot strike, Theon murmured. The crannogman did it, as if the thought had not belonged to any one man. Light moved where the marsh said it should not. Sound came from wrong corners. A beam, carefully set earlier, was encouraged to float a hand's breadth higher, and then settle again just as a man put his weight upon it. The Ironborn learned a pattern, and then the pattern betrayed them, which is another way of saying the neck taught them manners. After 2 hours of that, the big man's shoulders showed his intent. He would show patience if he had to and rage if he could, and neither would help him, and he knew it. Tonight, the crannogman said, we cut ropes where ropes still have pride. You will bring men with knives who do not mind sleeping in water to the chin. Then if so. And Theon volunteered himself, and Wex went with him, because words were inefficient at choosing him. Cragen came because he distrusted rivers and preferred to be present when they were misbehaving, in case he could shame them into stillness. They went into the black with reed blades tickling cheeks, and the water liking to find knees and higher. The raft's ropes were blacker than the water and slick with the film that lives on anything the marsh intends to own. Wex took a length in his teeth and worried at it like a dog trying to convince a stubborn bone of its destiny. Theon used a knife with a short blade and ate the knot like a patient rat. Twice he stopped with the sudden animal certainty that something watched. Twice the something turned out to be a bird that did not like men's plans. The third time was nothing at all, which was somehow worse. They left half the ropes where they were so that the wind could have a conversation with the rafts at dawn. When the conversation occurred, it was not eloquent. One raft took offense and departed the friendship. The other two discovered they had been invited to dance by a partner who had lied about his left foot. The Ironborn swore with an intimate inventiveness Theon had missed and did not miss. They leapt to catch lines and learned the hard truth of leverage with the marsh for their tutor. The crannogman watched from close enough to smell fear and far enough to avoid making any. We don't hold the moat, the crannogman said. We hold men's sense of the moat. That is enough. We unteach them gradually and send them away with a fever and a story. The big man will not see the virtue in it, but his numbers will. They don't count very well, Theon said. They will when they begin to cough blood, the man answered without heat. In the days that followed, Victarion's circle contracted with the weather and his patience. The marsh grew, as it always grows, without asking permission. Theon walked the edges and learned to see the water's mind as a pattern on its skin. He set small snares where a boot might blunder into them. He took them up again before boredom could ruin thrift. He sent 2 men with casks that had once been ale, now filled with rotting weed, to be split and tipped near the Ironborn latrine trench. Within a day, men there were blaming each other for the smell, and 3 days later, the smell had produced an argument with knives that had to be settled with a priest. Theon watched the priest bless a man with salt water that went brown on the way down his back, and knew that the drowned god's mercy in a place like this was laughter with its teeth bared. On the 4th dawn, the first proper snow since their arrival crept in over the reed tops, and made the whole marsh think about being a field. Theon stood on a knuckle of stone with his cloak clapped tight to him, and his breath a small fog, and watched Victarion walk the shore in a line with 2 of his captains. He could not hear the words, but he could read the shoulders. Fury, ironed flat into resolve. A plan had been chosen, not because it was good, but because a man like Victarion cannot be made to sleep long in a tent with an unsolved problem without breaking something to hear if the sound helps. They will come with shields and planks together all at once, Theon said. A wall on 2 rafts and men behind it. They will try to lay their belly on the land in one push and trust iron to make water act like road. Nah. The crannogman nodded the way trees nod when wind touches them as friend. We will draw them where the ground is honest about its dishonesty, said a woman whose hair was a wet rope down her back and whose grin was a moving thing, quick and strange. Mera, she added as an afterthought. Not like a name given, but like one remembered aloud to see how it tasted. My father asked me to keep an eye on you. I told him you are not so interesting as the stories make you. Then I should attempt to be less, Theon said. And she laughed silently, which was scarier than if she had laughed in the old way. They laid their answer the way good cooks lay a table, with care for the order of things, and an understanding that appetite is a tool. Trench where a raft might kiss, brush laid where it could be made to flare, paths trodden that led nowhere, and one that led somewhere useful. Theon set 2 small casks where a shelf of peat held them reluctantly, and he smeared their seams with pitch to encourage them to behave like secrets. He put Cregan and 3 stony shore men in a stand of dwarf willow where the ground had the decency to be solid, if a man asked it quietly. He sent Wex to lie in water and wait with a fish spear when most men's blood would have fled to more important parts of the body and begged leave. Victarion came at midday when the fog thought itself safe and the wind was undecided, which meant it could be offered employment. The first raft rode in low under the weight of shields held like a sloping roof. The second came a body length behind to make a deck of the first, and men flowed over them. No subtlety, no elegance, only that useful bluntness that has made many heroes and more corpses. Theon let them come 3 strides onto firmness, and held his breath for the 4th. When it did not hold, he blew 2 notes, and then one on the little brass mouthpiece he wore between his shirt and his skin. Fire woke in a line that pretended it had been sleeping. It went greedily where brush had been soaked, but not so greedily that it would not leave a gap where men wanted to run. The first raft's planks were not yet aflame when the current took it at a thinkable angle and made it consider the ditch with the honesty of water. The foremost Ironborn did what their fathers had taught them, pushed forward. The second rank did what the first had taught them, pushed harder. The raft obliged and pushed as well. And then the ditch took it to the hip and the men to the waist, and then both to the armpits, and then 3 to the mouth. Shields that had been roofs became doors nobody needed. Someone dropped a banner by reflex, and then had to retrieve it by pride, which is a poor reason to die, but a common one. Theon had arranged one kindness, a path that would hold 4 heartbeats worth of a man's weight, and then consider repenting. He showed it to them with 2 arrows, not to wound but to point. He watched as men took it, and as it betrayed them, and as others took it again. Learning is slow in water where pride has small feet. He went down off his stone into the wet, and put his knife into one man he recognized, soft-bellied, a bully from Harlaw with wrists too thick for bracelets. He stepped aside while Cregan's men did good work in silence. He heard Mira's arrow make the sound of a quick decision in a chief who had been delaying one. He saw Wex rise from blackness like a thing the marsh had coughed up and take a foot from under a man whose beard he could not have lifted with both hands. It was foul and orderly, savage and careful. And after a while the water decided the matter and not the iron. Victarion himself did not come into the ditch. He stood where the land could support him and watched the way a man watches his own ship in a storm, when there is nothing left to be done except pray and remember debts, and he did neither. His face did not move, but his fury went up from him like heat. When he turned at last and strode back toward the planked street his men had tortured into the marsh, he did not look left or right. He did not look at the men being pulled out of the peat bellies by cousins who would forgive them later for crying. He did not look at the rafts which were no longer rafts but fire and string. They held the edge until the afternoon was a tired old dog with burrs in its coat. The marsh eased into dark with its usual lack of curiosity about men's feelings. Theon sat on his hummock with his boots off and his feet in cold water up to the ankle, because the ache liked that kind of insult. He felt Mira settle nearby like a bird that has decided a branch will hold. Wex squatted at his side, a shadow with patience. Cregan took his knife to the bit of driftwood he kept for calming himself and scraped it into a shape that did not need to be named. "Your father," Mira said at last, "wanted to make a road with blood and iron across a place that remembers softer feet. He will not like you doing this instead." "He never liked anything I did," Theon said without self-pity, which surprised him so much he said no more. He understood that he would have to begin to live with who he was, and not merely with who he was not. Howland Reed came at dusk in the way old truths come. Unobtrusive, familiar to those who have been expecting them, unsettling to those who have convinced themselves that time only moves in straight lines. He was smaller than Theon had imagined, which seemed right as soon as he saw him. The marsh breeds men who carry their weight in places other than the shoulder. He wore mud on his calves as if he had grown it there. His hair had the color of water when it reflects bark. His eyes were green in the way that makes men tell songs about greenseers, even when they do not believe in them. "You stand," he said to Theon without introduction, like a man who has stopped trying to look taller and has therefore become harder to knock down. Theon bowed, because there are a few men in the world before whom a bow is not ceremony but good posture. "You have my thanks and the North's," he said, and he meant both without confusion. The North thanks itself when it remembers what is under it. Howland Reed said mildly, "You have done the one true clever thing a clever man can do. You have decided to be useful." His mouth made a near smile, and then undid it. "My son is at Winterfell. He has dreams that take more than they give. My daughter is here and makes her thread strings sing. My people will do as they always have done. Hold what cannot be held by men who count their worth in banners. Send letters if you must, but better to send men with small feet and clear eyes." He made a small gesture that was as much blessing as the neck ever gave. "Do not chase the big man. He is a mountain who knows only how to be a mountain. Mountains do not follow footprints into water." "So I won't," Theon said. "He will leave because the land refuses him. He will leave because he will not be granted a victory worthy of the effort." Howland said more shrewdly, "Men like that despise small wins. They prefer to lose grandly. We will deny him both, and he will go find some farmer's shore to burn where he can feel big while the cows run." Nentao. Victarion did leave within 2 days, not as a retreat that could be sung about, not as a triumph that could be paraded, but as a fact, wooden and wet, accompanied by coughing and a deep, bruised silence in his men that said more eloquently than any oration how the Neck had treated them. He took his planks and his ropes and his pride, and went back where water went deeper and offered a more honest fight. Theon watched the last raft grunt its way out of the ditch's unsmile, and felt a hook in his chest let go. It left a mark. Most true hooks do. They went up onto higher ground to dry what could be dried. The Cranagmen unstrung bows and strung fish with equal contentment. Mira made a noose of grass and teased a foolish snipe into it and let it go again, because she had eaten and could afford generosity. Howland Reed sat on a stump the marsh had prepared for him, and sharpened a spearhead on a stone with such absent patience that it took Theon a long while to see that the patience itself was the lesson, not the spear. "The wolves will want to hear a shape made of all this," Howland said. "They will want to put it in the place where they keep plans. Tell them we are not a plan. Tell them we are a weather." "I will tell Robb Stark," Theon said. "He already knows some of it, I think. He listens like a man who used to listen to the wind for rain on a roof, and now listens for mail on a map." "Medicine sa." Howland Reed's eyes smiled, which made the rest of his face choose to consider it later. "The boy will be a man who remembers he was a boy," he said. "That matters. Your place is not always at his elbow. Sometimes your place is where the ground can feel the shape of your foot and decide not to give way." "Beow." Theon rode back to Deepwood with Cragen and Wex, and 6 men who had learned to make their belt knives into arguments. The weather shifted twice and returned to itself. A raven found him on the second day with Manderley's fat seal, and a message half practical joke and half accounting. 3 iron-borne ships had tested White Harbor's chain and found it attached to more than metal. Somewhere beyond the point a longship had turned up, bottom up with 4 men roped to it, who would never again have the chance to complain about inconvenience. "We returned them to the waves with their God's words," Wyman had written. "Since we are hospitable folk." Their God did not answer, perhaps because he was attending to other guests. At Deepwood, Lady Cybele had the yard in motion the way a winter kitchen is in motion. Nothing frantic, everything with a reason under it. She counted arrows and cheeses, with equal care. She shook Theon's hand like a woman shaking a bell, and told him 2 boys had learned to hit a tossed gourd at 20 paces, and 1 man had learned to stop smiling when he missed. "He'll live," she said. "The smiler, I mean. The gourd's beyond help." Ah. He ate stew with meat that had argued hard against dying, and warmed his bones while a girl with windburned cheeks mended the thong on his left vambrace, and told him the story of her mother's sister, who had once set a broken thumb for Lord Glover by the light of a candle stuck in a tallow-smeared horn, and never been thanked properly. Which was proof that men needed women to keep a tally of agency. He slept like a man who had made the land learn his name with its tongue, and not only with its fist. A rider met him on the road out, with a letter sealed in gray wax, and a wolf's head pressed so deep it had taken half the stick. Robb's hand was the same. Eager letters, careful words. "You have done more than I asked and precisely what I needed," it said. "Mother says not to tell you so because it will encourage you to be proud as well as brave. I do not think you will spill the cup. Tywin has shifted his weight, and the river still bears him. I am not where I would choose to be, but I'm not drowned. Watch the shore. They will come back where they think you are not. In the margin, as before. Do not die." Theon put the letter against his chest and let it warm there. He wondered if the heat that came back from the parchment was the fire or his heart. He did not push his luck by asking. He went north with 24 to ride the edge of Bear Island's water and count sails. On the third afternoon he saw Alysanne Mormont put out from a cove with 4 boats, and a temper that made weather seem manageable, and he waved her down with a coil of rope held high. She came near enough to exchange shouted tendernesses. "Your sister will come again," she said. "She sent a boy with a bottle full of words to a cove where we keep traps for words. The bottle lies there now with 2 eels in it because it was a good shape, and I do not waste shapes." Lenderwine sorrow. "What did the words say?" Theon asked. "They said what men say when they cannot have a meal, and must make soup from a bone," Alysanne said. "Much brag. Little meat. Then we'll feed her something else," Theon answered. "Let her go to a table where the chairs are missing. I want her bored, not dead." "Men are wan. Bored women are dangerous," Alysanne called back with a grin. "But I like your meanness." She lifted a hand and was gone, the square sails laughing at the chop. When he turned inland again, the weather brought him to Winterfell as if the castle had pulled a cord on his belt. The moment he stepped onto the bridge he felt the weight of old stone press and welcome in the same breath. The yard had boys in it, in leather, and boys in it, in wool, and girls, in both. A wolf's shadow crossed the snow. Not quite a shadow, not quite a memory, somewhere between. Theon found himself moving quietly, because the place asked it of him, and because he liked being asked nicely by a thing that could command and had chosen not to. In the great hall, the fire made a sound like good advice given without smugness. Bran sat in the high seat, and the seat had learned his shape more since last time, which was a kind of magic Theon trusted. Would remembering boys. Osha stood at his shoulder. Maester Luwin's chain ticked in accompaniment to his breath. 2 new faces stood near the hearth. The girl wore green and brown, and had eyes like reed's reflections, and a weapon over one shoulder that was mostly string and habit. The boy looked as if a fever had taken him and left a portion behind, because it believed it would be needed later. "Mira Reed," Bran said, polite and pleased, with that curious mixture of lord and boy that had begun to take him and make something else. "And Jojen." They came with frog spear men who melted away at the river like smoke, and then the smoke turned into fish. He said it matter-of-factly, as if such travel were usual, which at Winterfell it might be. "We met your sister at the moat," Theon said to Mira, and watched her face change from curiosity to approval so quickly it made him realize he had been waiting for that change. He turned to Jojen and saw the boy regard him with a patience that did not belong to his years. "You were a different man in my dream," Jojen said with a courtesy that made the baldness of the statement into something kind. "There was more water in you." He tilted his head, a small bird's motion. "There is still water now, but the reeds have a hold. The kraken does not drown when it learns to curl its arms round roots." "Nenderu, do your dreams tell you whether Winterfell will keep its walls?" Theon asked, not to bait the boy, not to mock. Only to ask, because the question belonged to them all now. "Winterfell keeps what it loves," Jojen said. "And what it loves keeps it. The rest is weather." He looked past Theon at the door, as if something might come in on the next gust and bring news that would fit the words better. His mouth made no move toward a smile. His eyes remained old. Theon stood with Bran under the heart tree that evening, breath rising in steamy halos that drifted and were eaten by the cold. The red leaves were edged with frost. The carved face did not appear to have done any new thinking, or worse, appeared to have done all the thinking and saved none of it for the look it chose to show men. "You have a look," Bran said. "Like when wolves smell the air before a storm and you aren't sure if it's snow or a deer that's going to run in front of you." "It is both," Theon said. "And a fox as well. Victarion will go tear at the stony shore where he can bully the water. Asha will come again, because she is as stubborn as this tree and twice as lively, and because she likes games, she can almost win. Your marsh cousins will send something that isn't a letter and isn't a man and will be more useful than either. And somewhere in all of it, a rider will arrive with news nobody expected and everyone feared." "And no," Bran nodded, as if ticking items off a list. "Robb will write," he said. "Mother will tell him to be careful what he writes. Grey Wind will tear up something he shouldn't. Rickon will bite someone who will deserve it. Osha will tell me I have color in my cheeks, and it is not from the fire, and Maester Luwin will look like a sad goose when I say I want to climb the broken tower." "Don't climb it," Theon said softly. "I've done enough falling for both of us." They watched their breaths fade. Somewhere a raven told a story to another raven in a voice like chipped slate. Somewhere closer the kitchen cat made its circuit, dry-footing through snow like a god. When Theon left Winterfell again, because he could never stay. Staying is a luxury of men whose tasks can be done behind walls. He went with Wex and Kragan, and 4 new men who had been boys the last time he had noticed them. They were taller and thinner, and better at keeping their mouths warm with their collars. He took them to the cliff that had become his chair, and sat again, and listened. The sea offered a rumor. The wind decided to be helpful. The land had learned his weight, and did not creak when he moved. A fire on the horizon said Ironborn where no chart ought to put them that day. They had slipped in behind a weather that made watchmen drink soup, and think of the noon meal. Theon sent one rider inland with a strip of birch scrawled in soot. Bells, fires, women to the palisade, nets out, ponies into the stand of dwarf pine. He sent Wex along the beach with a rope and a knife, and a handful of crab claws. An odd list that somehow meant something precise to the boy. He turned to the new men, and when he talked their eyes watched, and their hands did not fidget. That, more than victory or good fortune, made him feel briefly like a man who had walked out of a story and back into his life. The ships came on a tide that believed in itself. The curve of their prows bit and rose and bit again. There were 3, not enough for a conquest, but more than for a courtesy call. He knew the lead by the paint at her nose, a black beak with old guilt, or memory of guilt. Not Asha's, not the Iron Victory. A lesser cousin sent to make the coast remember it could be frightened. He set his men not where the first panic would place them, but where the second thought would come. The first line of stones went up. The pitch went down. The wicker cages took their new occupants, smoke and damp, and a small quantity of rotted fish that had been kept for this purpose and none other. He felt nothing heroic, only an intense, satisfying competence. When the long ship nosed into the bay, it met water that paused and reconsidered itself in exactly the way Theon had intended. It held the ship in a slow embrace that was more insulting than a blow. Arrows yawed out from the scrub line and fell like dissuasion. The second ship came in too hot and found itself trying to occupy the same wet space as the first. That maneuver seldom ends well at sea. It ends worse in a place that enjoys watching men learn. A horn lifted high on the second ship's stern sounded a note Theon recognized. The call used on Harlaw for loose trouble, not fixed. The craft slewed and sulked and then gave up the insult and backed their oars. Theon let them go. He did not chase. Justice is rarely a sprint. When the last oar tucked, he lifted both hands and his line of men stood up and showed themselves so that the Ironborn would see faces, not masks, and carry the faces home to whatever passes for sleep. Fear given a face knows which door to avoid later. As evening came on, the light did that trick again of making the sea look as if it were thinking important thoughts in a language men had once known. Theon walked along the strand until the water could lift and kiss his boots. He put his hand down and tasted his fingers, and found them clean of pitch and fouled with salt, and he laughed aloud because he could not stop himself. He had been both. Once, fouled with pitch and clean of salt, and had told himself it was enough. It was not. He preferred this particular mixture. Hands that had done work and were not ashamed to be washed by a thing larger than the work. At Deepwood the night after, there was a small celebration that was not called one, because the North is suspicious of naming joy. Men ate meat that had not been salted and laughed like men laugh when they know the morning will hurt, but the hurt will be honest. Lady Sabelle looked in on it and said nothing except to tell a boy to keep his cup, where it would not soak the bowstring. Theon sat near the door so he could go if he had to and stayed because he did not. He found himself telling Wex a story about a Braavosi deckhand who had once taught him a card trick. He found himself liking the sound of his own voice less than the sound of the boy's breath when he laughed, which was a small fragile thing like a new flame in tinder. News came as it always does, when men are between sips and mouthfuls, and told jokes. A courier with the dust of 2 roads on him, and a look that had seen too many doors shut and opened again. He held a letter with a seal green as goosegrass. Theon broke it, and found Wyman's hand again. House Hornwood turns oddly in the wind, it read. Bolton's bastard sniffs and circles, but does not yet bare his teeth. I mistrust men who choose to be patient. It is unnatural. There was a postscript, wider and more careless. A crow with a message tied to its leg flew into my hall and shat on my table. That is a metaphor if you like it to be. Theon kept that to himself for a night, and gave it to a raven in the morning with his own line scrawled beneath. Watch the bastard as you would watch ice in spring. Beautiful until it breaks the wrong way. He added nothing about his own distrust. He did not need to. Robb had eyes. The days took on the pace of good work, well chosen. Theon rode, sat, taught, listened. He learned to walk the beach and know by how the kelp lay whether a hidden channel had shifted. He learned to read the angle of gulls as a kind of script. He learned which men lied to themselves about their courage, and which told the truth at such cost to themselves, that the truth itself took pity. He drank a cup of ale in the wolf's den, and listened to a woman sing a song about a fisherman's wife who had married twice, once to a man, once to a tide, and decided that his heart had been both and would, if the gods were kind, be neither exclusively again. Then winter reminded them that war was not the only agenda at court. The snow came hard out of the north with a howl like a woman scolding a drunk. It put a crust on the world that made men stumble at the very moment they were most confident, and made ponies lift their knees high and curse in their patient pony way. Theon moved his lines inland because he would not have men freeze on his account. He put women with bows in low sheds near the palisade, where smoke would find their faces, and not their neighbors. He sent to White Harbor for sacking to wrap arrowheads in against damp and felt, unexpectedly, a sort of love for the sight of a bolt of good cloth. He stood one noon on a hummock bald of snow, where wind had done him a kindness, and looked south. And for a moment the land itself looked back at him. He felt it, clean, cold, impartial. You are not new, it seemed to say. Men like you have come before, and some were better, and some worse, and all of them left their shapes in me in small ways. Do your small work then. I will remember as I choose. He nodded because arrogance had been scoured out of him by water and work. He lifted his hand in salute to a thing that could not be flattered. He turned to Cregan, whose breath made a cloud that looked like a house a boy might draw with a stick. We keep this, he said. All of it. The small victories, the hard lessons, the grudges, the unlikely friendships. We hold Asha at the edge until she is too bored to be brave here and too wise to be foolish. We make Victorian go tell men in taverns that the neck is a witch and the witches can keep it. We give Lord Merman songs to sing to his roast that do not flatter him too much. We let the marshmen write their letters in fish and reeds. We leave Winterfell alone unless it calls. We do this until the South is done tearing itself and remembers we are the roof. Nandy. Cregan grunted with pleasure in a way that did not demand more words. Wex touched Theon's sleeve and pointed, not to the sea nor to the road, but up again, where a hole in the cloud had tendered another star in daylight, faint and stubborn. Theon laughed, because he had begun to think of that star as a joke told only to him. He lifted his hand as if it might be a thing that could be caught and put in a pocket and saved for a bad hour. He lowered it again because some comforts must not be touched too often. Night brought a dream that woke him with his heart working hard and his hands empty. He had been on the bridge at Pike with the storm speaking fluently and the sea taking bites out of darkness with its white teeth. Balon Greyjoy wore the iron crown and the years and his pride, and he called Theon boy in a voice that was no longer quite the voice Theon remembered, and not yet the voice of a ghost. Asha stood with an axe across her shoulders and a smile that would cut anyone who touched it. Aeron raised wet hands and told a god to take a son who had already been taken elsewhere. In the dream, Theon said no, and the word became a knife in his own mouth, and when he woke, he could still taste blood and salt, and the particular bitterness that comes of having survived your upbringing. He sat with his feet near the embers and laughed quietly until the laugh turned into breath, and then the breath into sleep again, the sort of sleep a man has when his body knows it will be woken to do a thing it understands. At first light, a horn sounded from the west. 2 notes and a pause, and then 1. The code they had set for raiders, small enough to insult, but too many to ignore. Theon took his people and went in a line as thin as wire to the headland. The sea had made stubborn little waves out of slivers of ice that creaked at the shore. The 3 longships that had tried the cove before were back with one cousin, and Theon smiled because even the sea enjoyed repetition when men insisted on repeating mistakes. "Let them in," he said. "Let them feel welcome. Then let them trip over their own welcome and go home with bad manners to show their wives." Then they did it the way bakers do a thing they have done 6 mornings in a row, and will do 6 more without complaint. Stones fell where water would catch them and turn insult into accident. Smoke went downwind to tell a lie. Men showed themselves and then made themselves into trees again. Theon timed it by the sound of oars on air. When the longships backed out, one had a new scar along her side where a hidden post had spoken plain. Another carried fewer oars and more anger. The third had learned nothing and would have to be taught again later. Theon did not mind. Some pupils are the proof that teachers are needed. He sat on the cliff with his cloak around his shoulders and let the cold become a companion. He thought of Robb's fingers on a map, of Catelyn's eyes that could strip arrogance from a boy and leave the useful parts, of Brynden Tully's voice, "All rivers drown if you wait." He thought of Bolton, pale as an idea, and promised himself, not aloud, not in ink, but in the kind of promise that lives in muscles, that if the bastard from the Dreadfort ever came west, Theon would give him more winter than he knew how to chew. He ate bread that had been warmed on a flat stone, and it tasted like work and like a hearth, which is to say it tasted like victory in the North's language. He drank water that had considered being ice and then decided against it. He looked at Wex and at Cragen and at the woman with the rope scar mouth and at the boys who had learned to keep their hands warm by keeping them busy, and he felt a kind of love that had nothing to do with feasts or oaths or banners. It was the love of men who had carried stones up a hill together and set them down and found, when they looked back, that a wall had been made. Night fell earlier than it had any right to, which is the way of nights in a winter before a long one. Theon took the last watch because he trusted himself to hear the thing in the dark that would matter, and to ignore the things that wanted to be heard and did not deserve it. He listened to the marsh's sly breath unfolding miles south, and to the sea's honest labor, and to the small sleeping noises of men who had found their work that day and would find it again tomorrow. He let his breathing match theirs until whatever god keeps watch over men with knives and men with nets and boys with hawk-boned shoulders, until that god, or the absence of one, loosened the knot in his chest. Snow came again in the hour before dawn, fine as flower dust and insistent. He stood and let it salt his hair. He felt the ring on his finger, cold and sure. He felt his feet set into the land's memory. He looked east where a thin line of day made a promise it would keep slowly. He thought, without deciding to, of the star that liked to visit him when the clouds thinned. He thought it would not come today. That seemed right. Not every comfort needs to present itself when called. Wex arrived with a bundle of dried reeds, and a grin 3 parts shy, and 1 part wolf pup. He set the reeds by the coals, and watched them take. He pointed to the north with the hand that did not hold the little fish spear, and Theon knew without looking that whatever he would see would be work, not dread. He went to his men, and touched shoulders, and spoke names that had been boys the month before, and were becoming men's. He felt the day gather around him the way a cloak gathers, when a man takes it from a peg, and decides, yes, this is mine. And he went down to the strand again as the sea exhaled, and he smiled, because he was where he belonged, between water and wood, between tide and root, between a god who takes and a tree that remembers. The world made room for him without ceremony, and he filled it without apology, and the work waited like a friend at a door with a loaf in his hands and a knife ready to cut it, so there would be enough for everyone who came in out of the cold.